Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back roughly 1,000 years into a world where the simple act of closing your eyes and lying down flat was considered, by doctors, priests, philosophers, and your very nervous neighbor, to be somewhere between medically reckless and spiritually suicidal. You are not in your bedroom right now, not really. You are standing at the threshold of a medieval night, and everything you think you know about rest, comfort, and the correct angle at which a human body should surrender to sleep is about to get very, very complicated. Picture this: the fire has burned low, the rushes on the floor smell faintly of old straw and something you would prefer not to identify. The walls are stone, the wind is finding every gap it can, and the one candle left burning is doing its best and failing. Around you, several other people, family members, servants, maybe a dog of ambiguous ownership, are settling in for the night. And not one of them is lying flat. They are propped, wedged, arranged against walls and bolsters at angles that look to your modern eye profoundly uncomfortable. And yet to them, this is simply correct. This is safe. This is how you survive the night. You probably won't survive this episode without learning something that makes you stare at your ceiling for 20 minutes afterward. But that is honestly part of the experience, so welcome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is locally. There is something I love about knowing that someone in a completely different time zone is doing the exact same thing you are doing right now, which is lying down, flat, horizontally, without fear, and listening to history in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the story of why medieval people slept sitting up is not just a quirky historical footnote. It is a window, a long, drafty, slightly terrifying window, into how an entire civilization understood the human body, the soul, the night itself, and the invisible world that they were absolutely certain came alive the moment you closed your eyes. It touches medicine, religion, architecture, class, fear, and something so deeply human that you will probably feel it tugging at you even now, in your warm bed, in your modern world, with your scientifically engineered pillow. Sleep, for most of human history, was not a passive thing. It was not the neutral, checked-out state we tend to think of today when the biological off switch, the nightly reboot. Sleep was an event, a negotiation, a period of genuine vulnerability during which your body was present, but your rational mind was, by the understanding of the time, temporarily absent. And if your mind was absent, then something else might wander in. The night had texture and weight and population. It was full, medieval European. And we are going to spend most of our time in Western Europe, roughly between the 9th and 15th centuries, though we will wander a little, did not approach sleep casually. Every element of how you prepared for it, where you did it, who you did it near, and crucially, at what angle you positioned your body, carried meaning. Medical meaning, moral meaning, spiritual meaning. The idea that you would simply flop down horizontally, pull something over yourself and let go, that was not the default. In fact, for much of this period, that posture was the one that made people nervous. And so the world developed a sleep culture so different from ours that it almost feels like science fiction. Physicians wrote careful instructions about the angle of inclination. Theologians had opinions about what your sleeping body communicated to God. Architects built furniture specifically designed to hold you semi-upright through the night. Ordinary people, exhausted from a day of physical labor that most of us cannot imagine, still found themselves propped against bolsters, wedged into sleeping chairs, or folded into beds designed less for lying down and more for reclining at a very specific and medically approved tilt. Scholars still argue whether the sleeping upright practice was as universal as some early sources suggest, or whether it was more of an elite, text-driven prescription that filtered down unevenly through society. But the evidence across medical manuscripts, household inventories, and illuminated manuscripts is consistent enough to tell us that this was real, it was widespread, and it was deeply intentional. Tonight, you are going to follow this story from the inside out. You are going to feel the cold of those stone rooms, smell the straw, understand the fear, and by the time we are done, you might find yourself looking at your own flat, horizontal, blissfully unangulated sleeping position with a new kind of appreciation, or possibly a new kind of low-level existential unease. Either way, history has done its job. The night is long, the fire is low, and the story, as all the best ones do, starts in the dark. You are lying down, flat, completely horizontal, spine parallel to the earth, face aimed at the ceiling, arms resting at your sides. To you in this moment, that is just sleep. That is just the natural, obvious, gravity-assisted way a tired human body arranges itself at the end of a long day. You do not think about it, you do not question it, you simply go flat and then you go somewhere else for a while. Now imagine that every person around you, your neighbors, your priest, your physician, the scholar in the monastery 3 villages over, the midwife who delivered half the children in your town, all of them look at that position and feel a quiet, crawling unease. Not dramatic panic, not screaming, just a low, steady, culturally inherited discomfort, the kind that lives in the back of the throat and says, that is not quite right, that is not safe. That is the position of a man in a coffin. Welcome to the medieval night, where the fear did not just live under the bed, it lived in the very angle of your body. To understand why lying flat made medieval people nervous, you have to understand something fundamental about how they experienced the boundary between the living world and everything else. That boundary to a medieval mind was not fixed. It was permeable. It shifted and thinned at certain time. At dusk, at midnight, at the turning of seasons. And it was thinnest of all when you were asleep. Because sleep, by the medical and theological understanding of the era, was the state in which your rational soul loosened its grip on your body. Your senses withdrew. Your will went quiet. And in that quiet, that loosening, that temporary absence of the self, the night had room to move. This was not metaphor. This was not poetry. This was understood as straightforward biological and spiritual reality. The sleeping body was a body with its defenses lowered, and a body with its defenses lowered, lying flat and open to the ceiling and whatever existed above it, was a body making itself available in ways that the waking world would never permit. The fear had layers, and they are worth pulling apart, one at a time, because each layer tells you something different about the medieval mind. The first layer was the most immediate and the most visceral. The night hag. You may know her by other names. The old hag, the mare, the mara, the cauchemar, in French tradition, the alp, in Germanic folklore. She went by many names across European cultures, but her method was consistent. She came at night when you were sleeping, and she sat on your chest. Sometimes she was described as a heavy, shapeless pressure. Sometimes as a crouching figure, dark and female with eyes that caught no light. Sometimes she arrived riding an animal, or as an animal herself. But always, she came to the sleeper who was lying flat, exposed, unguarded, and she pressed the breath out of them. What she was actually describing and what medieval people experienced as supernatural visitation, we now recognize as sleep paralysis. That vivid, terrifying state between sleeping and waking in which the body's motor systems are still offline, but consciousness has partially returned, producing the sensation of pressure, presence, and paralysis. It is genuinely frightening even when you know exactly what it is. Imagine experiencing it without that framework. Imagine waking, unable to move, feeling crushed, certain something is sitting on you, with no neurological explanation available, and every cultural narrative around you confirming that yes, something probably is. The solution, in folk tradition, and in the advice of people who considered themselves practical and experienced, was straightforward. Do not lie flat. The night hag preferred the supine sleeper. She liked the open chest, the unprotected throat, the body arranged like an offering. If you slept propped, if you kept your body at an angle, you were less accessible. The architecture of your position was a mild form of spiritual armor. This belief was widespread enough to show up not just in folk tradition, but in the margins of medical texts, in household advice literature, and in the kind of practical wisdom passed from mother to daughter, from innkeeper to traveler, that never got formally written down but shaped behavior at every level of society. You tilted yourself not because a doctor told you to, though doctors would also tell you to for entirely different reasons you will hear about soon, but because your grandmother told you to and her grandmother told her, and somewhere in that chain of transmission was a real night of real terror that nobody wanted to repeat. The second layer of fear was more theological and in some ways more unsettling because it came from an authority that medieval people could not simply decide to ignore. The church had views about the sleeping body. Sleep itself was not sinful. Even the most rigorous theologians acknowledged that the body needed rest, that God had designed rest into the human system, that Christ himself had slept. But the sleeping body was morally unguarded in a way that concerned serious thinkers about the soul. When your will was inactive, when your rational faculties had temporarily stepped back, you were open to influences that your waking self would reject. Demonic suggestion, sinful dreaming, the kind of nocturnal experience that required confession. And here is where posture entered the moral conversation in a way that feels almost absurd to a modern ear, but was perfectly logical within its own framework. The flat, supine position was the position of death. It was how you laid out a corpse. It was how the dead were arranged for burial, how the effigy on a tomb looked, how a body was prepared for its final journey. To sleep that way, deliberately, voluntarily, was to imitate death in a way that some theologians found theologically careless at best and symbolically dangerous at worst. You were rehearsing the wrong thing. You were making your body into a version of a corpse. And a corpse, by definition, had no will, no resistance, no capacity to refuse whatever came toward it in the dark. Scholars still argue whether this theological discomfort with the supine sleeping position was ever formally codified into specific church doctrine, or whether it remained a more diffuse cultural anxiety. But the anxiety was real, and it expressed itself in real behavior. The fear beneath the bed, in other words, was not one thing. It was a braid of terror, woven from folk memory and theological instruction, and very real physical experience, and it all pointed in the same direction. Stay upright, keep an angle. Do not make yourself into the shape of a dead man, and then close your eyes and hope for the best. You, in your flat bed, in your dark room, are doing exactly what they were afraid of. And yet here you are, still breathing. Probably fine. Probably you are in that half place now, the soft blur between awake and asleep, and something shifts in the room. Not dramatically, not with any sound or movement you could point to and name, just a change in the quality of the dark, a subtle redistribution of the silence, and somewhere in the oldest part of your brain, the part that predates language and reason and the comfortable modern certainty that the night is empty, something notices, something pays attention. Medieval people would have known exactly what that feeling was. They had a name for it, or rather, they had many names for it, and behind every name was a detailed, culturally agreed-upon explanation for what was happening to you, why it was happening, and what your sleeping posture had to do with your chances of surviving the encounter intact. We touched on the night hag in the last stretch of this journey, that heavy, pressing, breath-stealing visitor who preferred the flat sleeper. But the world of medieval nocturnal threat was considerably more populated than just one figure, and the belief that a horizontal body was an invitation went far deeper than folk superstition. It was woven into the intellectual framework of the era at every level, from the peasant who had never read a single word to the university-trained physician who had read far too many, and it produced a remarkably consistent cultural conclusion. The body lying flat in the dark was a body in a posture of submission, and submission, in a world full of invisible and not always friendly forces, was a position you wanted to be very careful about adopting. Let us talk about the demon of the horizontal body, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange and genuinely fascinating, and where medieval cosmology reveals itself as a system of extraordinary internal logic. The medieval Christian worldview inherited and elaborated on a rich tradition of thought about the relationship between the human body, the soul, and the demonic. Demons in this framework were not merely metaphorical. They were not symbols of internal psychological conflict or literary devices for dramatizing temptation. They were real, active, present, and specifically interested in the human body during its most vulnerable states. Illness attracted them, grief attracted them, drunkenness attracted them, and sleep, that nightly loosening of the rational will, attracted them with particular reliability. The theological mechanics worked like this. Your soul had a hierarchy of faculties. At the top sat reason, the divine spark, the thing that made you human and connected you to God. Below reason sat the sensitive faculties, emotion, imagination, desire. And below those sat the purely vegetative functions of the body, the things that kept you breathing and digesting and alive without any conscious direction. When you slept, reason stepped back. The sensitive faculties became dominant, and in that state, the imagination, which medieval thinkers understood as a genuine physiological faculty located in a specific chamber of the brain, became both hyperactive and unguarded. A skilled demon working at the level of the imagination could shape your dreams. Not crudely, not by appearing in a red suit with a pitchfork and announcing its intentions, but subtly by manipulating the images and impressions that floated through your sleeping mind, nudging them toward sin, toward despair, toward the kind of nocturnal experience that upon waking left you feeling corrupted rather than rested. Now here is where the body's position became critically important in this theological and physiological system. The humoral medicine of the era, which we will explore in much more depth in the next section of tonight's journey, held that the body's internal fluids, its humors, moved and pooled according to posture. A body lying flat on its back caused blood and other humors to pool in specific ways that were believed to overheat the brain, particularly the posterior ventricle, where the imagination lived. An overheated imagination was a hyperactive imagination. A hyperactive imagination during sleep was, by straightforward medieval logic, a wide-open door for exactly the kind of demonic image manipulation that the theologians warned about. Sleeping, upright or at an incline, kept the humors moving more correctly. It prevented that dangerous pooling. It kept the imagination from becoming a fever-bright room full of unlocked doors. The physical angle of your body was, in this system, a genuine prophylactic against demonic interference, not superstition layered on top of medicine. Medicine and theology speaking with one voice, arriving at the same practical recommendation from completely different directions. The specific demon most associated with sleeping bodies in the medieval tradition was the incubus and its female counterpart, the succubus. And while these figures have acquired a rather lurid reputation in subsequent centuries, their original theological context was considerably more nuanced and considerably more frightening than the way they tend to be portrayed today. The incubus was not primarily a figure of transgressive fantasy. It was a figure of violation and corruption, a thing that came to the sleeping body precisely because the sleeping body could not refuse. It targeted the supine, the unconscious, the unguarded. It worked through the imagination and left its victims feeling depleted, spiritually compromised, and often physically unwell in ways that their physicians would then attempt to treat with. Adjustments to diet, sleep schedule, and, you already know where this is going, sleeping posture. The Church's response to reports of nocturnal demonic visitation was not, as you might expect, simple dismissal. Theologians of considerable sophistication wrestled seriously with these accounts. Thomas Aquinas himself wrote about the incubus with careful, almost clinical attention, and while he was clear that the demon could not create new life or operate outside divine permission, he was equally clear that the experience of demonic nocturnal visitation was real, that it happened to real people, and that it had real spiritual consequences that needed to be addressed. Scholars still argue whether the widespread cultural belief in nocturnal demonic visitation was primarily a theological construction, filtering down through preaching and confession, or whether it was a bottom-up folk experience, sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucination, nightmare, being interpreted through the theological framework available. But either way, the behavioral result was the same. People arranged their bodies carefully before sleep. They said their prayers in specific sequences designed to seal the room spiritually. They made the sign of the cross over the bed, and they did not lie flat. There was also a quirky detail buried in some of the more specialized medical and demonological literature of the period that feels almost too strange to be true, but is attested in multiple sources. The belief that sleeping with your mouth open while lying flat was particularly dangerous, because the open mouth of a supine sleeper was understood in some traditions as a literal portal, an unguarded entrance through which smaller demonic entities or evil spirits could enter the body directly. The mouth, pointing upward in the flat sleeper, was an open invitation. The mouth of an inclined sleeper, pointing more forward or to the side, was less accessible, less architecturally convenient, for whatever was drifting through the night air, looking for a way in. You are almost certainly reading this with your mouth slightly open. That is fine. You are in the 21st century. The invisible population of the medieval night has largely been renegotiated, at least in the dominant cultural imagination, but that particular detail, the open, upward-pointing mouth of the flat sleeper as an unlocked door, is the kind of thing that once lodged in a medieval mind never quite left it. And it is the kind of thing that once lodged in your mind might make you just slightly more aware than usual of exactly how your face is oriented as you drift off tonight. The demon of the horizontal body was not one demon. It was a whole system, a convergence of theology, medicine, folk memory, and genuine neurological experience, all pointing at the same thing: the flat-lying, sleeping human as uniquely, specifically vulnerable. And the solution, elegant in its simplicity, was just to stay tilted, to keep the angle, to deny whatever moved through the medieval dark its preferred point of entry. You are tilted slightly right now, aren't you? Just a little, just enough. Good. There is a particular kind of authority that settles over a room when a physician speaks. You have felt it, probably, in some modern form. That slight internal adjustment you make when someone with a medical degree tells you something about your own body, the way their certainty becomes your certainty almost before you have had time to evaluate it. Now multiply that feeling by about 1,000. Strip away every mechanism you have for independently verifying what you are being told. Add the full weight of a 1,000-year-old intellectual tradition behind every word, and you begin to understand what it meant when a medieval physician told you that lying flat while you slept could genuinely, seriously, physiologically harm you. This was not folk wisdom. This was not the nervous superstition of uneducated peasants afraid of the dark. This was medicine. Formal, university-trained, text-based, absolutely confident medicine. And it said, with the calm authority of a tradition stretching back to ancient Greece and running unbroken through the Arab scholars who preserved and expanded it, and into the European universities that received it and taught it for centuries, the horizontal sleeping body is a body in danger. The correct position for sleep is inclined. The angle is not a comfort preference. The angle is a prescription. To understand why, you need to spend a little time inside the humeral system, because it is the operating framework behind nearly everything. A medieval physician believed about the body, and once you understand it, the sleeping upright recommendation stops seeming strange and starts seeming almost inevitable. The humeral theory of medicine originated with the ancient Greeks, was systematized most influentially by Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century, was preserved, translated, and significantly expanded by Islamic scholars, most notably Avicenna, whose Canon of Medicine became one of the central medical textbooks of the medieval European university and arrived in the lecture halls of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, has received wisdom of the highest order. To question it was not merely to disagree with a theory, it was to set yourself against the accumulated authority of the greatest medical minds in recorded history. Almost nobody did that. The basic framework worked like this. The human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour had qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and each was associated with an organ, a season, a temperament, and a vast web of correspondences that extended outward through diet, climate, age, and daily habit. Health was the correct balance of these humours. Disease was imbalance. And almost everything you did with your body, what you ate, when you ate it, how much you moved, how much you rested, and crucially, in what position you slept, affected the balance. Sleep itself, in this system, was understood as a state in which the body turned its vital heat inward, away from the extremities and toward the digestive core, in order to complete the process of concocting, essentially cooking and transforming, the food you had consumed during the day into usable nourishment. This was not a passive process, it was active, heat-dependent, and positionally sensitive. The stomach, understood as the central engine of this process, needed to be positioned correctly relative to the liver, which was understood as the organ that produced blood from the concocted food. And both of these needed to be positioned correctly relative to the heart, which distributed the vital spirit through the body. When you lay completely flat, according to this system, several dangerous things happened simultaneously. The stomach, no longer aided by any gravitational assistance, struggled to move its contents toward the liver efficiently. Undigested or partially digested matter sat and stewed, producing corrupt vapors that rose. Because vapors always rose, that was simply what vapors did, toward the brain. The brain, receiving these corrupt vapors, became disordered. Its own humoral balance was disrupted. The ventricles, those crucial chambers where the animal spirit and the imagination resided, became clouded and overheated in the ways we discussed in relation to demonic interference, but now understood in purely physiological terms. The result, according to medical texts of the period, was predictable and unpleasant. Bad dreams arising from corrupt vapors, morning headaches, a sense of heaviness and confusion upon waking, disrupted digestion leading to an accumulation of phlegm or worse, an excess of black bile, melancholy, in the medical terminology of the era, which was not merely sadness, but a genuine pathological state associated with fear, paranoia, disturbed sleep, and a cascading deterioration of overall health. Sleeping at an incline solved these problems elegantly within the framework. With the head elevated and the torso tilted, gravity assisted the stomach in moving its contents correctly. The corrupt vapors had a harder time ascending to the brain because the brain was higher and the path was less direct. The liver received what it needed at the right time. The concoction process completed correctly. You woke clear-headed, well-digested, with your humours in good order, and your day beginning from a position of balance rather than deficit. The recommended angle varied somewhat depending on which text you consulted and which specific health concerns was being addressed. Some physicians were fairly casual about it. Prop yourself up, incline the head, do not be completely flat. Others were remarkably specific. Avicenna's canon recommended beginning the night on the right side, which positioned the liver on the right side of the body, beneath the stomach, allowing gravity to assist in drawing the stomach's contents downward for processing, then transitioning to the left side in the middle of the night as digestion progressed, and finally, if necessary, ending on the back. But never the back alone for the whole night, and always with the head elevated. This was not advice casually offered. This was a full positional protocol, backed by detailed physiological reasoning, endorsed by the most respected medical authority in the medieval world, and repeated in medical education and in the popular health literature that filtered medical knowledge out to literate non-physicians. The Regimina Sanitatis, health regimen texts written for educated lay audiences, consistently included sleep posture as a topic requiring explicit guidance. Sleep was one of the 6 non-naturals, the category of factors outside the body's inherent constitution that nonetheless governed health or disease: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, evacuation and retention, and the passions of the soul. Getting any of these wrong was a genuine medical concern. Getting sleep wrong, its duration, its timing, its position, was a route to real, measurable, physiological harm. There is a delightfully odd detail buried in some of the more specialized medical literature of the period, which is the extensive discussion of which side of the body was more dangerous to sleep on for extended periods, and why. Sleeping too long on the left side was considered problematic because the weight of the body pressed on the heart, which sat on the left, and this compression could disrupt the vital spirit. Sleeping on the stomach was almost universally condemned. It compressed all the digestive organs simultaneously and was considered almost aggressively unhealthy by any physician worth their fee. Sleeping on the back, flat, was the position that got the most warnings because it was the position that produced the most corrupt vapors, the most disordered dreams, the most dangerous pooling of humors in the brain. Scholars still argue about how much of this advice was actually followed by ordinary people versus how much it remained a text-bound prescription circulating among physicians and educated elites. But the consistency of the recommendation across centuries and across different medical traditions, Greek, Arabic, and European Latin, suggests that it was at minimum shaping the design of furniture and sleeping spaces in ways that made the inclined position the practical default for anyone who had the means to arrange it. The physician's authority, in other words, and the demon fear of the theologian, and the folk terror of the night hag, were all pointing in the same direction. Stay inclined. Keep the angle. Do not give your body, your humors, your dreams, or whatever moved through the medieval dark any more access than you absolutely had to. Your body is flat right now, and your humors are doing whatever they like, completely unsupervised. A medieval physician would have had thoughts about that. You are going to do something small right now, just as a thought experiment. You are going to look at the surface you are lying on, your mattress, your sofa, your carefully engineered foam and spring system with its thread count sheets and its temperature regulating cover. And you are going to try to see it the way a medieval person would see it. Not with envy, exactly, though envy would be completely understandable, with something closer to incomprehension. Because what you are lying on right now, this ordinary, unremarkable, taken-for-granted object that you probably bought without much ceremony and think about only when your back hurts, would have been, for most people, across most of medieval European history, an object of extraordinary significance, a marker of identity, a declaration of status, a piece of furniture so valuable that it was itemized in wills, argued over in inheritance disputes, carried across continents as part of a dowry, and displayed in the most public room of the house, precisely because it needed to be seen. The bed, in medieval Europe, was not primarily a comfort object. It was a status object, and that distinction changes everything about how you understand the sleeping culture of the era. Let us start with what a bed actually was, because the word covers a much wider range of objects than you might expect. At the very top of the social Hierarchy, a great bed. What would eventually become the famous great bed of ware type, beds of almost theatrical scale and elaboration, was a piece of furniture that announced its owner's wealth and importance with every carved post and embroidered hanging. These beds had frames, of course, often of heavy oak, sometimes gilded or painted. They had ropes or leather straps stretched across the frame to support a mattress. They had mattresses, multiple mattresses, in the grandest cases layered, one on top of another, each filled with different materials depending on how much you could spend. Straw at the bottom, then wool, then the finest beds topped with feathers, specifically the down of geese or swans, which was so expensive that a good feather mattress represented a significant financial asset in any household inventory. Then came the bedding itself, linen sheets, woolen blankets, fur coverlets in the grandest households, then the pillows and bolsters, then the curtains hanging from a canopy or tester above, which served the combined practical purposes of keeping out drafts and keeping in heat, and the social purpose of creating a private enclosure within what was almost always a shared room. A fully fitted great bed in a wealthy household was an investment comparable to a significant piece of land. When Henry VIII died, his beds were inventoried alongside his palaces. When a merchant of modest prosperity died in 14th century London, his bed and bedding often represented the single most valuable item in his entire estate. But here is the thing that reframes the entire sleeping upright question in a new light. Most people did not have one of these beds. Most people did not have anything approaching one of these beds. Most people, across the medieval period and well into the early modern era, slept on arrangements that made the inclined position not a medical prescription to be consciously followed, but simply the natural consequence of the sleeping situation available to them. Consider the peasant household, which is where the overwhelming majority of medieval Europeans actually lived. A single room or two-room structure shared by the family and sometimes by the livestock in the coldest months, because the animals provided warmth and the warmth was necessary for survival. The floor was packed earth or stone covered with rushes or straw. Furniture was minimal and multi-purpose. The thing you slept on was most likely a pallet, a simple sack of straw or hay laid directly on the floor or on a low wooden platform. It was not designed for horizontal sleeping in any particular sense. It was designed to get you off the cold ground and to provide a minimal layer of insulation. You slept on it in whatever configuration kept you warmest, which in a cold room, with multiple bodies generating heat, usually meant pressed together, layered under whatever coverings you had, in positions that were more about shared warmth than any individual comfort preference. In many households, the most desirable sleeping position was not on the pallet at all, but near the fire. The bench beside the hearth, the settle, a high-backed wooden bench specifically designed to retain heat. These were prime sleeping real estate in a cold medieval home. And sleeping on a bench or a settle produced, naturally and automatically, a posture that was not horizontal. You were seated or semi-reclined, propped against the back of the bench, your body at an angle determined by the furniture rather than by any deliberate medical or spiritual calculation. You were sleeping upright because that was where the warmth was, and that was what you were sitting on. And the fact that physicians and theologians also recommended sleeping upright was, from your peasant perspective, probably a coincidence you had never thought about. This is one of the genuinely interesting dynamics of medieval sleeping culture. The prescriptive literature, the medical texts and health regimens, and theological guidance about correct sleeping posture was produced by and for the educated classes. It assumed you had a bed, had choices about how to arrange yourself in it, and needed guidance on making those choices correctly. But the material reality for most people was that the choices were made for them by poverty, by cold, by the physical constraints of the spaces and furniture available. The prescription and the practice arrived at the same place, inclined, propped, not fully horizontal, but for completely different reasons. The bed as status object also expressed itself. in a fascinating piece of domestic geography that shaped sleeping posture in ways that are easy to overlook. In a wealthy medieval household, the best bed, the great bed, the master bed, was not in a private bedroom in the modern sense. It was in the great chamber, or the sola, a room that was semi-public, a room in which the lord or master of the household received visitors, conducted business, entertained guests of sufficient importance, and also slept. The bed was there to be seen. Its quality communicated the household's wealth. Its hangings and coverings were chosen partly for comfort and partly for display. In this context, how you slept in that bed carried social weight. Collapsing into complete, abandoned horizontal unconsciousness in a bed that was also a reception room was not quite the done thing. The posture of sleep in a semi-public bed was a posture that needed to maintain at least a suggestion of composure. You were propped. You were arranged. You presented yourself in sleep in a way that was consistent with the dignity of your station. Because the line between sleeping and receiving an early morning visitor was not always as clear as you might hope, and being discovered completely flat, mouth open, limbs sprawled, in the most expensive piece of furniture you owned, was not the statement you wanted to make. There is a wonderfully odd detail in several medieval household management texts, the kind of practical guides written for stewards and householders about the correct running of a noble establishment, which is the instruction that the master's bed should be made each morning in a specific way that communicated something about the household standards even when the bed was empty. The arrangement of the bolsters and pillows, propped and shaped in the correct configuration, was itself a kind of performance of the bed's purpose. The empty bed looked like a bed ready to receive a person who would sleep in it correctly, which is to say, inclined, propped, arranged with dignity. The flat empty bed, pillows scattered, was a bed that communicated disorder. Scholars still argue about the extent to which the great bed's semi-public function actually constrained sleeping posture in practice, versus how much people simply slept. However, they slept once the curtains were drawn, but the ideology of the bed as a site of display and dignity was real and consistent enough to leave traces everywhere in the documentary record. The bed was a throne for the unconscious body, and thrones, as anyone who has ever sat on one knows, are not designed for lying flat. There is a moment that happens every night, somewhere between finishing your last meal and closing your eyes, that medieval physicians considered one of the most medically significant transitions of the entire day. Not sleep itself, not waking. The period immediately after eating, that warm, slightly heavy, pleasantly drowsy window, when your body is doing something important and complicated, and, according to every medical authority from Galen forward, deeply sensitive to interference. You know this feeling? You have felt it after a large dinner, that gravitational pull toward the sofa, that loosening of ambition, that quiet, physical argument your body makes for horizontal surrender. Medieval medicine looked at that feeling and said, yes, your body is asking for rest, and you should give it rest, but not like that. Not flat, never flat, not now, not while the work is happening. Because the work, in the humoral understanding of digestion, was extraordinarily delicate, and its success or failure cascaded through your entire physical and mental well-being in ways that made your sleeping posture in the post-meal hours not a minor lifestyle preference, but a genuine health decision with measurable consequences. Let us go deeper into the medieval gut, because it is a strange and fascinating place, and because understanding what medieval physicians believed was happening inside the digestive system after a meal explains not just the sleeping upright prescription, but an entire architecture of daily life organized around supporting or protecting this central biological process. Digestion, in the Galenic and Avicennian framework that dominated medieval European medicine, was understood as a process of concoction, a word that carries its literal meaning here, the cooking or transformation of raw material into something refined and usable. The stomach was a kind of vessel, a pot, and the vital heat of the body was the fire beneath it. Food entered the stomach and was subjected to this heat, broken down, transformed, separated into the nutritive substance that would eventually become blood and the waste that would be expelled. This first concoction in the stomach produced what was called chyle, a whitish fluid that then passed to the liver, where a second concoction transformed it into the four humors, with blood being the primary and most important product. From the liver, the blood moved to the heart, where a third concoction infused it with vital spirit, and from the heart it was distributed through the body. This is a system of cascading transformations, each one dependent on the success of the previous one and each one sensitive to disruption. And the most sensitive point, the foundation on which everything else rested, was that first concoction in the stomach. If the stomach's concoction went wrong, if the vital heat was disrupted, if the contents moved incorrectly, if the process was interrupted or corrupted, everything downstream was affected. Bad concoction in the stomach meant bad chyle reaching the liver. Bad chyle meant bad humors being produced. Bad humors meant disease, imbalance, the cascading dysfunction that the medieval physician spent most of his professional life trying to prevent or correct. Now, what disrupted the stomach's concoction? Several things, and medieval medical literature catalogued them with the thoroughness of people who took this seriously. Eating too quickly, eating too much, eating the wrong combination of foods, drinking cold liquids with meals which quenched the vital heat. Vigorous physical activity immediately after eating which drew the vital heat away from the stomach toward the muscles and left the concoction process undermanned. And sleeping horizontally immediately after eating, which allowed the stomach's contents to pool and sit without the gravitational assistance that an inclined position provided, and which also, in some versions of the theory, allowed the vital heat to dissipate or misdirect itself in ways that left the concoction incomplete. The correct post-meal protocol, as described in the Regimina Sanitatis and in the more practically oriented medical literature, was specific and consistent across different authors and traditions. After eating, you should rest, but not sleep immediately. You should sit quietly or walk very gently for a period that allowed the initial stages of concoction to begin before the body entered the deeper withdrawal of full sleep. When sleep did come, it should come in an inclined position, head elevated, body tilted to support the stomach's continued work. The right side was preferable in the early hours, as we discussed, because the liver lay on the right, and the inclined right side position placed the stomach above and slightly tilted toward the liver, assisting the passage of chyle when it was ready. The bile question added another layer of complexity to this already elaborate picture. Yellow bile, one of the four humors, was associated with heat and with the function of the gallbladder, and its correct distribution through the digestive system was considered essential to healthy digestion. An excess of yellow bile produced a hot, sharp, irritable humor that could corrupt the other humors and produce a characteristic syndrome of restlessness, anger, disordered sleep, and vivid, disturbing dreams. The specific dietary and positional triggers for excessive yellow bile production were discussed at length in medical literature, and lying flat after a rich meal featured prominently among them. The flat position, combined with a stomach full of meat and wine, was understood as essentially a recipe for bilious excess, the consequences of which would be felt not just in the night's sleep, but in the following day's mood, energy, and physical well-being. There is a wonderfully specific, quirky detail in some of the dietary literature of the period, which is the extended discussion of which specific foods were most dangerous to consume before sleep, ranked by their humoral qualities and their potential to disrupt the night's concoction. Onions were controversial. Some physicians considered them warming and therefore helpful to the digestive fire. Others considered their vapors too sharp and likely to disturb the brain. Cheese eaten late at night was considered almost universally problematic, its heavy, cold, phlegmatic quality too slow and difficult for the nocturnal concoction process. Raw fruits were frequently warned against as evening foods, their cold and wet qualities damping the vital heat at exactly the moment it needed to be most active. Wine was more nuanced. Small amounts of good wine were considered helpful, warming the stomach and supporting concoction, but excess wine was a reliable route to the bilious excess that made for terrible nights. The meal itself, in a wealthy, medieval household, was structured around these concerns in ways that shaped not just what was eaten, but when, in what sequence, and how the evening then proceeded. The feast began with foods considered opening and appetizing. Light, acidic, sharp things that prepared the stomach. It moved through heavier, more nourishing dishes. It ended with foods considered closing and settling. Spiced wines, digestive confections made from sugar, and warming spices, the medieval equivalent of an after-dinner digestive. These closing foods were not just pleasant conclusions to a meal. They were medical interventions designed to seal the stomach, support the vital heat, and prepare the digestive system for the night's concoction work. After this carefully sequenced meal, the household moved towards sleep in a way that honored the process that was now underway inside every body that had eaten. There was no rushing to bed immediately after the last course. There was a period of gentle activity, conversation, perhaps music, perhaps light reading for those who could. And then the arrangement for sleep was made with the digestive state of each person in mind. The bolsters were positioned, the incline was established. The body was placed at the angle that gave the stomach its best chance of completing its work correctly through the night. Scholars still argue about how rigorously these post-meal protocols were actually followed in practice, versus how much they represent an idealized prescription that real medieval households approximated rather than achieved precisely. But the consistency of the advice across centuries and cultures suggests that the underlying anxiety about post-meal sleeping posture was genuinely felt and genuinely acted upon at every social level that had the means to act on it. Your own body, right now, is doing something your medieval ancestors would have recognized. That slow, warm, slightly drugged feeling of late-night horizontal rest with a digestive system working quietly in the background. The difference is that you are lying flat and your vital heat is completely unsupervised and your yellow bile is doing exactly as it pleases. Whether that worries you or comforts you probably says something interesting about how thoroughly medicine has reshaped what counts as a reasonable thing to be anxious about. Your stomach, at least, seems unconcerned. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, not literally. You are listening. Keep going. And try to build the room around you, not your room. The room. The medieval sleeping room, which is a concept so different from your current understanding of what a bedroom is, and does that calling them both by the same word feels almost misleading. Your bedroom is a private space, probably the most private space in your life, designed around a single primary purpose, furnished to support that purpose, sealed from the rest of the household by a door you can lock, temperature-controlled, acoustically softened, lit to your preference, or darkened completely. It is, by the standards of almost every human being who has ever lived, an extraordinary luxury of solitude and environmental control. The medieval sleeping room was none of these things, and the way it was none of these things shaped sleeping posture in ways that had nothing to do with medicine or theology and everything to do with the raw, physical reality of surviving a night in a building that was, by your standards, barely a building at all. Let us build the room properly from the outside in, because the architecture is the argument. The walls first. Stone in the grander structures. Castles, manor houses, wealthy urban townhouses. Thick stone, which sounds like it should be insulating, but which, without any interior treatment, was actually a reliable cold sink, drawing heat out of the air inside and radiating cold inward with steady, patient efficiency. Timber-framed construction in smaller buildings, the gaps between the timbers filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks plastered with clay, dung, and straw, which was considerably better than nothing and considerably worse than anything you would currently accept in a structure you intended to sleep in. The walls breathed, not metaphorically. Air moved through them. Wind found gaps. Rain found gaps. The boundary between inside and outside was more of a strong suggestion than an architectural fact. The floor, stone or packed earth in most structures, occasionally wooden boards in wealthier buildings covered with rushes, straw, or reed matting that served simultaneously as insulation, as a surface covering, and as a slowly accumulating archaeological record of everything that had been eaten, spilled, tracked in, and shed in the room over however long it had been since the floor covering was last changed, which was less often than you would hope. The floor was cold. The floor was where the cold air pooled because cold air sinks, and in a room with no underfloor heating and minimal wall insulation, the temperature differential between floor level and head height could be significant enough to matter. The ceiling, low in most domestic structures, smoke blackened in any room with an open hearth or a fireplace that did not draw perfectly, which was most fireplaces in most buildings for most of medieval history. The hearth was the heat source, and the hearth produced smoke, and the smoke went up, and in rooms without efficient chimney, which is most rooms before the 12th century, and many rooms well after, the smoke distributed itself through the upper part of the room before finding its way out through a hole in the roof, a gap under the eaves, or simply through the general porousness of the structure. This meant that the upper part of the room was smoky and the lower part was clearer, which created a vertical quality gradient in the air that was another argument, added to the cold floor argument, for not sleeping at floor level if you could help it. The windows. Small because glass was expensive, and the alternative, wooden shutters or oiled cloth, provided minimal light transmission and minimal insulation, meaning that larger openings meant more cold and more draft. Windows were typically shuttered at night, which helped somewhat with the cold, but eliminated the possibility of any fresh air circulation, producing the characteristic medieval sleeping environment of sealed, smoky, warm-breathed, multiply-occupied air that would register on any modern air quality monitor as a significant health concern. Now put people in this room. Not one person. Multiple people, because private sleeping was a luxury of the very wealthy, and even they did not always practice it. The medieval sleeping room was typically a shared space, shared by family members, by servants sleeping at the foot of a master's bed or on pallets near the door, by guests in households wealthy enough to receive them, and in the poorest households, occasionally by animals. Bodies generated heat, and heat was the scarce resource, and the logic of shared sleeping was not primarily social or cultural, but thermodynamic. You slept near other people because other people were warm and the room was cold and the night was long. This physical reality of the shared, cold, smoky, architecturally porous, medieval sleeping room shaped posture in ways that were completely independent of any medical or theological prescription. Consider the settle, that high-backed bench, near the fire that we mentioned earlier. It was not designed as a sleeping surface, but it was frequently used as one precisely because it combined two scarce resources, proximity to heat and elevation from the cold floor. Sleeping on a settle meant sleeping seated or semi-reclined, back against the high wooden back, legs extended or curled, body at an angle determined entirely by the furniture's geometry. The physician's recommended sleeping incline and the peasant's firebench sleeping posture were arriving at similar angles from completely different directions. Consider also the bolster and pillow arrangements in beds that did exist, even modest ones. The purpose of bolsters, those long cylindrical pillows that ran across the full width of the bed, was not primarily comfort in the modern sense, but elevation. They lifted the head and upper body above the level of the mattress, creating the inclined position that was simultaneously medically recommended, spiritually safer, and practically useful in a room where the air quality improved with height. Multiple bolsters, stacked, could produce a significant incline. Illuminated manuscripts showing sleeping figures consistently depict this arrangement. The sleeper propped against a mound of bolsters, upper body elevated, in a posture that reads less like lying down than like sitting at a very shallow angle. The cold itself was a powerful postural force. When you are genuinely cold, the body's instinctive response is to curl inward, to draw the extremities toward the core, to make the body smaller and denser, and better at retaining its own heat. This curling posture is incompatible with full, horizontal extension. The cold medieval sleeper was naturally inclined toward a more compact, semi-curled, often semi-upright arrangement simply because that was what cold bodies do. The elaborate theological and medical justifications for sleeping inclined were being enacted by shivering peasants who had never read a word of Avicenna and were simply doing what their bodies told them to do in a cold room with insufficient bedding. The smoke added another dimension. The upper air was smokier, the lower air was clearer but colder. The optimal sleeping position in a smoky, cold room was one that kept your head above the worst of the floor-level cold while keeping your face below the smoke layer, which in practical terms meant a moderate elevation, a position somewhere between fully upright and fully flat, in which the head was lifted but not so high as to be in the thickest smoke. This is again approximately the inclined position that medicine prescribed and theology endorsed, arrived at through the entirely pragmatic calculation of a person trying to breathe comfortably through a night in a room that made comfortable. Breathing a genuine project. Scholars still argue about how much the architectural reality of medieval sleeping spaces drove sleeping posture versus how much the cultural prescriptions about correct posture shaped the design of sleeping spaces. Whether the chicken or the egg came first in this particular circle of cold, smoke, and theological anxiety, but the convergence is striking. The room itself, its coldness, its smokiness, its furniture, its shared warmth economy, all conspired to make the inclined sleeping posture the natural default, the thing your body would find even without being told to find it. Your room right now is warm, sealed, clean-aired, and designed around the assumption of horizontal sleep. It is a room built for a different body in a different world. The medieval sleeping room was built, or rather simply existed, as a space in which the horizontal body was uncomfortable, impractical, and, as you have heard from the physicians and the theologians, inadvisable. The architecture was the argument. The cold was the enforcement. And the smoky, shared, firelit medieval night made upright sleeping not a choice, but simply the shape that sleep took in the spaces where it happened. You have been building a picture, section by section, of a sleeping world that was colder, more crowded, more spiritually populated, and more medically supervised than anything your modern night contains. And now you are going to add one more layer to that picture. One that is, in some ways, the most tangible, the most physically specific, the most instructive about how seriously medieval people took the business of sleeping correctly. You are going to look at the objects, the actual, physical, carefully designed and deliberately arranged objects that medieval sleepers used to achieve and maintain the correct sleeping posture through the night. Because if you want to understand how deeply a culture believes something, you do not just read what they wrote about it, you look at what they built. The pillow system of medieval Europe was not a comfort technology. It was a postural engineering project. Let us start with the bolster, because the bolster is the foundation of everything else, and because it is a piece of furniture that has almost entirely disappeared from modern sleeping culture in a way that makes it easy to underestimate its importance. A bolster was a long cylindrical cushion, typically running the full width of the bed, stuffed with wool, straw, or in wealthier households, feathers. It sat at the head of the bed, and its primary function was elevation. Not the gentle, shallow elevation of your modern pillow, which lifts your head a few inches off the mattress and is designed primarily to support the cervical spine in a horizontally sleeping body. The medieval bolster lifted the entire upper torso. It was placed not just under the head, but under the shoulders, under the upper back, creating an inclined surface against which the whole upper body could recline at a meaningful angle. In the grandest beds, a single bolster was just the beginning. Above the bolster came pillows, smaller, square or rectangular cushions that could be stacked, arranged, and adjusted to fine-tune the angle and the support. Household inventories from wealthy medieval and early modern estates regularly list not one or two pillows, but 6, 8, 10, arranged in configurations that the modern eye reads as excessive, but that the medieval household manager understood as the necessary toolkit for constructing the correct sleeping position. You did not just drop your head onto a pillow, you built a structure, you engineered a slope, you arranged the cushions in a configuration that held your body at the prescribed angle through the night, even as sleep relaxed your conscious control over your own posture. The angle itself was a subject of some practical debate among those who thought carefully about these things, and the solutions people arrived at were ingenious in their simplicity. One approach, described in various household texts and visible in manuscript illustrations, was the wedge bolster. A bolster that was not cylindrical, but tapered, thicker at one end than the other, so that when placed under the upper body, it created a natural incline rather than a bump. The sleeper lay against the wedge, and the wedge held the angle without requiring the sleeper to maintain it through muscular effort. This was important because the whole point of sleep was to let the body relax. And a sleeping body that was trying to hold itself at an angle through muscular tension was not a resting body. Another approach was the architectural integration of the sleeping surface itself. Some medieval beds, particularly in the Germanic and Northern European traditions, were built with a slightly inclined base. The head end of the bed frame was higher than the foot end, so that the entire sleeping surface tilted gently toward the feet. This meant that anyone lying on the bed was automatically inclined without any additional pillow arrangement, because the bed itself was a slope. These built-in inclined beds appear in enough visual sources and household inventories to suggest that this was not a rare curiosity but a genuine design tradition, an architectural expression of the cultural and medical commitment to inclined sleep. The curtains and hangings that surrounded the great bed contributed to the postural system in a less obvious way. The bed curtains, drawn closed at night, created an enclosed microenvironment, warmer, slightly more humid, protected from drafts, that made it possible to maintain the inclined position without the additional cold-driven curling that an exposed sleeper might resort to for warmth. The enclosed bed was a climate-controlled sleeping capsule, and within that capsule, the carefully arranged bolster and pillow system could function as designed, holding the body at its prescribed angle through the night without fighting against. The room's cold. There is a delightfully specific, quirky detail in the records of several royal and aristocratic households, which is the existence of a dedicated servant role, sometimes called the groom of the chamber or a similar title depending on the household and period, whose responsibilities included the correct making of the master's bed each morning, and, in some cases, the correct arrangement of the sleeping lord or lady at bedtime. This was not merely turning down the sheets, this was positioning the bolsters in the correct configuration, arranging the pillows at the correct angles, and, in some accounts, actually assisting the sleeper in finding and settling into the prescribed position before the curtains were drawn. The angle of your sleep was, at the highest social levels, someone else's professional responsibility. This has a slightly absurd quality to it from a modern perspective, the idea of a staff member whose job included tucking a nobleman into the correct medical sleeping position but within the framework that produced it, it made complete sense. The bed was an expensive and important piece of furniture. The sleeping position was a medically significant health decision. The household was a managed system in which every element was supervised for quality and correctness. Why would sleep be exempt from that supervision? The pillow and bolster technology also served purposes beyond maintaining the inclined position. The bolster's elevation kept the sleeper's face above the level of the mattress, which mattered in practical terms because medieval mattresses, particularly the straw-filled lower mattresses in layered systems, were not inert surfaces. They were ecosystems. They harbored insects, retained moisture, accumulated the biological residue of repeated use, and produced, at mattress level, an air environment that was measurably different from the air a few inches higher. Sleeping with your face elevated above the mattress surface was not a luxury preference. It was a meaningful quality of air decision in a world where mattress hygiene operated on a very different schedule from your own. The bolster also served as a kind of anchor for the sleeping body, a reference point that the relaxing, unconsciously shifting body could find and rest against without falling into the fully flat position that everyone from the physician to the priest had warned against. A body sleeping against a firm bolster had something to lean into, something that maintained the angle passively without requiring the sleeper to remain alert to their own posture. This passive maintenance of the correct position was the whole engineering achievement. Not to make the sleeper consciously hold an angle, but to build an environment in which the correct angle was the path of least resistance, the default that the relaxing body found naturally. Scholars still argue about whether the elaborate pillow and bolster systems described in elite household records were representative of broader sleeping culture, or whether they were a luxury technology that most people simply approximated with whatever they had: a rolled-up cloak, a bundle of straw, a folded blanket. But the underlying principle, the elevation of the upper body as the correct sleeping configuration, appears consistently across social levels, expressed in different materials and with different degrees of engineering sophistication, but pointing in the same direction. Your pillow right now is doing something quite different. It is supporting a horizontally oriented spine, cradling the weight of a head that is going nowhere but sideways. It is a comfort object, not a postural engineering device. It is not trying to hold you at any particular angle. It is simply trying to make you comfortable in the position you have already chosen, a position that, for most of human history, was the position nobody wanted to be in after dark. The bolster has largely vanished from the modern bed. The wedge pillow survives, mostly in medical contexts. Acid reflux, sleep apnea, post-surgical recovery, which is its own quiet echo of the medieval conviction that the inclined position was medically necessary rather than merely optional. Engineering was always in service of the belief, and the belief, as you have heard from every direction tonight, was that the flat body in the dark was a body taking an unnecessary risk. The bolsters held the angle held the night, and the night, properly managed, held everything else together. There is an institution that touched every single aspect of medieval life, from the moment you were born to the moment you were buried, and everything that happened in the hours between those two events. What you ate, who you married, how you worked, how you grieved, how you celebrated, and yes, how you slept. You could not step outside its influence in medieval Europe. It was the air you breathed intellectually, the framework through which every experience was interpreted, the authority whose approval or disapproval shaped behavior at every level of society, from peasant to king. The church had opinions about sleep. Of course it did. It had opinions about everything, and its opinions about the sleeping body, the sleeping soul, and the correct posture for nocturnal rest were not peripheral theological footnotes. They were woven into the fabric of medieval spiritual life with the same seriousness that the physicians brought to their humoral prescriptions and the folk tradition brought to its night hag warnings. To understand what the church thought about sleep, you need to start with what the church thought about the body, because the two are inseparable. The medieval Christian understanding of the human person was not the clean Cartesian split between mind and body that later centuries would develop, in which the body is simply the vessel and the mind is the real you. The medieval understanding was more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more demanding. The body was not the soul's prison, it was the soul's partner, the material expression of a spiritual reality, and it would be resurrected at the end of time and reunited with its soul for eternity. This meant the body mattered. What happened to the body mattered. How the body was positioned, treated, disciplined, and presented mattered, not just for health, but for spiritual well-being. Sleep entered this theological framework as a genuinely complex problem. On one hand, sleep was natural, necessary, and divinely sanctioned. The body needed rest. Even Christ had slept. In the famous gospel scene, sleeping in the boat during the storm, requiring the disciples to wake him. Sleep was not sinful in itself, but sleep was also the state of maximum physical vulnerability and minimum rational control, and both of those qualities had significant spiritual implications. The vulnerability question was the one that connected most directly to sleeping posture. A sleeping body, by the theological understanding of the era, was a body whose will had temporarily withdrawn. The rational soul, the faculty that chose good over evil, that resisted temptation, that maintained the moral vigilance that Christian life required, was inactive during sleep in a way that it was not during waking. This was not a moral failing, it was simply the nature of sleep. But it created a window of vulnerability that the church took seriously because the forces that were interested in corrupting the human soul did not take nights off. The connection between sleeping posture and this spiritual vulnerability came through a symbol that was so pervasive in medieval culture that it is almost impossible to overstate its reach. The symbol of the corpse, the supine human body lying flat on its back, arms at its sides or crossed on its chest, face aimed at the ceiling. This was the position of the dead. It was the position in which bodies were laid out after death, prepared for burial, arranged for the funeral rites. It was the position of the stone effigies on tomb monuments, those carved representations of the deceased that filled the floors and walls of medieval churches, the flat-lying figures that worshippers walked past and knelt beside and prayed over every time they entered a sacred space. The visual language of the supine body in medieval culture was the visual language of death. It was so consistently associated with death that encountering a living person in that position carried an automatic symbolic charge that a modern person living in a culture with a very different visual vocabulary around death simply does not feel. When a medieval person saw a living body lying completely flat, something in their culturally trained perception registered a mild wrongness, an echo of the tomb, a visual rhyme with mortality that the waking mind might consciously override, but that the deeper, symbol-saturated medieval imagination felt without being asked. Sleeping in the corpse position was, in this symbolic framework, a kind of rehearsal for death, and rehearsing death deliberately and nightly carried theological implications that serious thinkers found worth examining. Death itself was not the problem. Christian theology was quite clear that death was a transition, not an ending, and that the properly prepared Christian should face it without terror. But the premature adoption of the death posture, the voluntary nightly assumption of the position that death imposed, suggested a troubling relationship with mortality that some theologians found spiritually careless. There was also a more specific liturgical dimension to the posture question. The position of prayer in medieval Christian practice was not the flat-lying position. It was standing or kneeling or prostrating, but prostrating meant face down, not face up, which was a significant distinction. The supine position, face upward, was not a posture of prayer or penitence in the Christian tradition. It was, as we have established, the posture of the dead. For the sleeping Christian, who was advised to enter sleep in a state of spiritual preparation, with prayers said and soul composed and mind turned toward God, the posture of death was arguably the wrong frame for that spiritual transition. The correct posture for sleep, in the theological imagination of the period, maintained at least a suggestion of the waking, praying, spiritually attentive body. The inclined position, upper body elevated, was closer to the kneeling or seated posture of prayer than to the supine posture of the tomb. It suggested readiness rather than abandonment. It said, symbolically, that the sleeper was resting but not surrendering, withdrawing temporarily but not departing permanently, present in the body even in its most vulnerable state. Scholars still argue about whether there was ever any formal church teaching on sleeping posture. A decree, a canon, a specific theological ruling, or whether the connection between posture, death symbolism, and spiritual vulnerability remained at the level of cultural assumption and pastoral advice rather than doctrinal prescription. The evidence suggests the latter, but cultural assumptions backed by the full authority of the Church's symbolic system were not weak forces. They shaped behavior as surely as formal rules and often more durably. The monastic tradition added another dimension to the church's engagement with sleeping posture, one that was more practical and less symbolic, but equally influential on the broader culture. Monasteries were, among other things, laboratories of regulated daily life, institutions in which every hour was structured, every activity prescribed, every bodily function addressed by the rule that governed the community. The rule of Saint Benedict, the most influential monastic rule in Western Europe, addressed sleep with characteristic practicality. Monks were to sleep in their habits, ready to rise for the night office, in conditions that maintained the appropriate modesty and vigilance. The night office, matins, required monks to rise in the middle of the night for prayer, which meant that monastic sleep was structurally interrupted, divided into periods of rest and waking that we will explore in more detail later in tonight's journey. The practical consequence of this interrupted sleep structure was that monks often slept in positions that allowed for relatively quick and dignified rising, seated, semi-reclined, arranged in their choir stalls or on simple beds, in ways that maintained readiness rather than complete surrender. The monastery modeled a relationship with sleep that was watchful, disciplined, and postured for alertness even in rest, and this monastic model, visible and influential throughout medieval culture, contributed to the broader cultural sense that the correct sleeper was an inclined sleeper, a ready sleeper, a sleeper who had not entirely let go. The Church's contribution to sleeping upright culture was, in the end, less about specific rules than about the deep, symbolic environment it created and maintained. It made the supine body mean something beyond simple physical position. It loaded the horizontal sleeping human with associations, death, vulnerability, spiritual abandonment, that made the inclined alternative not just medically preferable or practically convenient, but morally and spiritually expressive. To sleep inclined was to sleep as a living Christian rather than as a carved effigy. To sleep upright was to maintain, even in unconsciousness, some shadow of the vigilance that the Christian life required. The stone faces on the tomb, monuments in every medieval church, looked at the ceiling with their flat, carved, permanently supine expressions. The living, the Church suggested, should look at something else. Imagine being watched while you sleep. Not in any sinister modern sense, not a camera, not an intruder, but watched in the way that medieval noble life arranged for almost everything to be watched, witnessed, verified, and performed. Imagine that the moment you retire for the night is a public event, attended by people whose job it is to be present, to observe, to assist, and implicitly to confirm that the whole proceeding is happening correctly, with appropriate dignity, in the manner befitting your station. Imagine that the bed you sleep in is in a room that is not entirely private, that the act of sleeping is not a withdrawal from public life but a continuation of it by other means, and that how you arrange your body for the night communicates something about who you are, what you represent, and whether you are the kind of person who deserves the power and deference that your position commands. This was the reality of sleep at the highest levels of medieval society, and it shaped sleeping posture in ways that had nothing to do with medicine or theology and everything to do with the performance of power. The political dimension of medieval sleep is one of those historical details that sounds almost too strange to be true, but is documented with extraordinary richness in the household records, ceremonial manuals, and chronicle accounts of royal and aristocratic life. Sleep at the level of kings and great nobles was not a private biological function. It was a ceremony. It had a name, the coucher in French court tradition, the retiring ceremony, and it was conducted with a formality and an audience that would strike any modern person as somewhere between touching and deeply exhausting. The coucher worked roughly like this. As the evening drew toward its close, the lord or king prepared to retire. This was not done alone. A sequence of attendants assisted with the undressing, the washing of hands and face, the donning of the night garment. Each step of this process was assigned to specific household officers whose rank determined which part of the ceremony they participated in. The removing of the outer robes might be performed by a chamberlain. The handling of the night garment might be reserved for a gentleman of the bedchamber. The actual preparation of the bed, the warming of the sheets, the arrangement of the bolsters, the turning back of the coverlet was performed by servants of appropriate rank, and the whole sequence was observed by a wider group of courtiers, whose presence at the coucher was both a privilege and a duty. The king or lord then got into bed. And here is the crucial point for our purposes. He did not simply collapse. He arranged himself. He was, in fact, assisted in arranging himself, positioned against the bolsters in the correct inclined posture, covered to the appropriate level, composed in the manner that the ceremonial demanded. The curtains might then be drawn, but in some court traditions, the bed curtains remained partially open for a period, during which the attendant courtiers remained present. Conversation might continue, petitions might be received, and the lord conducted a final period of semi-public business from the inclined position of his ceremonially prepared bed. This practice, receiving visitors, conducting business, holding informal audiences from bed, was not unique to the retiring ceremony. The lit de justice, the formal judicial session conducted by the French king from his bed or throne, was one of the most significant ceremonial events in French royal life. The lever, the morning rising ceremony that was the coucher's mirror image, involved a reverse sequence of attendants and assistants, with the king receiving courtiers while still in bed, transitioning from sleep to wakefulness in a carefully staged public performance. The bed was a throne of a different kind, and the body in the bed was a body that needed to look like it belonged on a throne, which meant, among other things, that it needed to look dignified, composed, alert, even in repose. The inclined sleeping position, upper body elevated against the bolsters, served this requirement perfectly. A lord received in his bed, meeting the eyes of petitioners and courtiers, needed to be positioned in a way that communicated authority rather than vulnerability. The fully supine lord, flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, unable to meet anyone's gaze without effort, communicated exactly the wrong things: weakness, abandonment, the corpse posture that the church had already loaded with problematic symbolism. The inclined lord, propped against his bolsters, upper body raised, face forward, could receive a visitor with something approaching the dignity of a seated audience. The famous illuminated manuscripts depicting royal bedchamber scenes almost invariably show this arrangement. The king or nobleman in bed is not flat, he is propped, he is elevated, he is arranged in a position that reads, even to a modern eye, as composed and intentional rather than collapsed and abandoned. The artists who painted these scenes were not idealizing or correcting what they observed. They were depicting the actual ceremonial reality of elite medieval sleep, in which the inclined position was the visually correct, socially appropriate, politically legible posture for a body at rest in a position of power. The political stakes of sleeping posture extended beyond the immediate ceremonial context into questions of succession, legitimacy, and dynastic survival that could hardly have been more serious. The king's bedchamber was a site of political intelligence. Who was admitted to the coucher, who attended the lever, who had access to the king in his most private hours. These were questions of factional competition, of influence and access, of the kind of proximity to power that medieval political culture valued extraordinarily highly. The gentleman of the bedchamber in the English royal household, the first gentleman of the bedchamber in the French court, held positions that sound domestic and minor, but were in fact among the most politically significant roles in the kingdom, precisely because they provided daily, intimate, witnessed access to the sovereign's person. In this context, the king's sleeping posture was not just a personal preference or a medical recommendation, it was a political statement visible to everyone in the room. The correctly inclined, composed, bolster-supported royal sleeper was a king who maintained his dignity even in vulnerability, whose body expressed authority even at rest, whose sleeping posture was consistent with the waking performance of power. The king who slept flat and sprawling even behind closed curtains, risked a different kind of symbolic message, one that the attentive medieval courtier, trained to read bodies and their arrangements for political meaning, would not miss. There is a wonderfully specific, quirky detail in some of the French court ceremonial records of the later medieval period, which is the careful specification of the angle at which the royal bolsters should be arranged, not as a vague general elevation, but as a precise configuration that had been established by tradition and that the servants responsible for bed-making were expected to reproduce exactly. The angle of the king's sleep was, in other words, a matter of court protocol, as fixed and as meaningful as the arrangement of his crown or the seating order at his table. Scholars still argue about how much of the elaborate bedchamber ceremony of medieval and early modern courts was genuinely medieval in origin versus how much it developed and elaborated in the later period, particularly in the Burgundian court culture of the 15th century that influenced so much of subsequent European royal ceremonial. But the underlying dynamic, sleep as performance, posture as political statement, the bed as a theatre of power, is present throughout the medieval period in forms that vary in elaboration but are consistent in principle. You are sleeping tonight with no audience. No chamberlain has arranged your bolsters. No gentleman of the bedchamber is observing your posture. No courtier is reading the angle of your recumbent body for signs of political meaning. Your sleep is entirely, luxuriously private. It is worth noting, just quietly, that this absolute privacy of the sleeping self is an historically very unusual situation, and that for most of the people whose story you are inside tonight, sleep happened in the presence of others, witnessed and watchful. Performed even in its most unconscious moments, the king slept inclined because he was always, even in sleep, the king. You have been spending time, over the course of this journey, in some fairly rarefied air. Royal bedchambers with their ceremonial bolsters and their gentlemen attendants, wealthy merchant households with their layered mattresses and their feather pillows and their carefully managed post-dinner digestive protocols, physicians writing careful Latin prescriptions for the correct angle of sleep, theologians weighing the spiritual implications of the supine position. It has all been genuinely fascinating, and it has all been, in a very specific way, the history of people who had the luxury of thinking carefully about how they slept because they had enough of everything else. Enough food, enough warmth, enough security, enough leisure to make sleep quality a subject worthy of attention and investment. Now you are going to come down, all the way down, to the floor almost literally of medieval social reality, where the overwhelming majority of actual medieval Europeans spent their actual medieval nights. And what you find there is a sleeping culture that shares some surface features with the elite world you have been visiting. The inclined posture, the communal arrangement, the smoke and cold, but arrives at them through a completely different route, driven not by prescription or ceremony or theological refinement, but by the blunt, unglamorous, utterly human logic of survival. The medieval peasant's night was not a philosophical problem. It was a physical challenge. Consider who we are talking about. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of the medieval European population, depending on the period and region, were agricultural laborers, serfs, villeins, free peasants, tenant farmers whose daily existence was organized around the fundamental imperatives of growing enough food, staying warm enough not to die, and maintaining the physical capacity to do the same thing again tomorrow. These were not people whose bodies were a canvas for medical theory or a stage for political performance. These were bodies that worked, that hurt, that were hungry in ways that the physicians and theologians writing about sleep had likely never experienced personally, and that fell into sleep each night with the total, uncomplicated exhaustion of organisms that had spent every available calorie. The structure of the peasant dwelling shaped the night before anything else. The typical peasant home in much of medieval Western Europe was a longhouse or a small two-room structure, a hall and a bower, or simply a single, undivided space that served simultaneously as kitchen, living room, sleeping room, and in many cases as shelter for the household's animals during the coldest months. The animals were not incidental to this arrangement, they were essential. A cow, a pig, a few goats in the lower end of the longhouse generated meaningful body heat that contributed to the survivable temperature of the human sleeping space at the upper end. The smell was considerable. The warmth was real. The trade was, by the logic of cold winters and minimal fuel, entirely rational. In this space, sleeping arrangements were determined by three factors in strict priority order: warmth, proximity to the fire, and available surface area. The most desirable sleeping position was near the hearth, where residual heat from the day's cooking fire lingered through the night, and where the first warmth of the morning fire would reach you earliest. The least desirable was near the door or the animals, where drafts were strongest and cold pulled most aggressively. The family arranged itself along this thermal gradient each night, with the most vulnerable members, the very young, the very old, the sick, positioned closest to what warmth existed, and the hardiest members taking the colder positions. The surfaces available for sleeping were, by the standards of the wealthy household we have been visiting, almost nothing. A pallet of straw on the floor, or on a low wooden platform if the household ran to that luxury. A pile of rushes and whatever coverings were available. A rough woolen blanket, worn cloaks, animal skins in the households that had them. In the coldest periods, families slept pressed together under shared coverings, body heat pooled and rationed like any other scarce resource. The intimacy of shared sleep, not a social choice but a thermal necessity. This communal sleeping arrangement produced naturally inclined postures not through any medical calculation, but through the simple geometry of multiple bodies sharing a limited warm space. When several people sleep together under shared coverings on a narrow surface, full horizontal extension becomes impractical. Bodies fold around each other, shoulders stack, heads rest on arms or on the nearest available elevation. The semi-curled, semi-upright posture that the physician recommended and the theologian endorsed was the posture that a cold body in a crowded space naturally found without being told to find it. The bench by the fire, the settle, the simple wooden seat near the hearth was genuinely prime sleeping real estate in the peasant household. Men who had come in from a day of heavy agricultural labor or who had been out tending animals in the night frequently slept on or near the bench simply because it was there, because it was warmer than the floor, and because the effort of crossing the cold room to the pallet was, at the end of a 15-hour day of physical work, an effort that exhaustion simply refused. Sleeping seated or semi-reclined on a bench near a dying fire was not a medical prescription being followed. It was a tired human body taking the shortest path between consciousness and unconsciousness. The work itself shaped the sleeping body in ways that are easy to overlook. Medieval agricultural labor was physically comprehensive in a way that modern, sedentary life is not. Plowing, planting, harvesting, carrying, building, threshing. These activities loaded the body in ways that produced specific patterns of fatigue and specific postural needs in rest. A body that had spent the day bent forward in labor often found a semi-reclined position more comfortable than full horizontal extension, because full extension after heavy forward-bending work could produce the kind of aching stretch that keeps you awake rather than the supported rest that lets you sleep. The peasant body, shaped by its labor, sometimes found the inclined position simply more comfortable, without any reference to Avicenna or the Church's thoughts on the corpse posture. There is a genuinely touching, quirky detail in some of the agricultural and seasonal literature of the medieval period, which is the brief, rare acknowledgement of what peasant sleep actually looked like, not as prescription or complaint, but as simple description. The harvest season brought a particular quality of exhaustion that observers noted with something like admiration. Laborers who fell asleep wherever they stopped, on the edge of the field, against a cartwheel, slumped against each other in the last of the evening light, in postures that were entirely determined by gravity and exhaustion and the nearest available surface. These were not inclined sleepers following medical advice. These were human beings whose bodies had simply run out and taken whatever position they landed in. Scholars still argue about the quality and duration of peasants' sleep in the medieval period, whether the combination of physical exhaustion, poor nutrition, cold and interrupted nights produced something more like chronic sleep deprivation than the restorative rest that the medical literature prescribed, and what the long-term health consequences of that deprivation were for populations. That depended entirely on physical capacity for survival. But the picture that emerges from the scattered evidence is of a sleeping culture that was adaptive, communal, and shaped overwhelmingly by physical necessity rather than by the elaborate, prescriptive frameworks that the literate classes produced. The common folk slept as they could, where they could, in whatever position the cold and the crowding and the exhaustion allowed. They slept upright because the bench was warm. They slept curled because the night was cold. They slept pressed together because bodies are warm, and the alternative was to be cold, and alone and cold is worse. The physician's prescription and the peasant's reality rhymed in the end, because the human body responds to cold and exhaustion and crowded surfaces in ways that are fairly consistent regardless of whether you have read Avicenna. The common folk did not sleep sitting up because they had been told to. They slept sitting up because the night left them no better option, and because, at the end of a day that had taken everything, even the angle of rest was not a choice you had the energy to make. There is something happening right now in the quiet of your night that you probably do not think of as historically significant. You are going to sleep, and you're going to stay asleep, more or less, continuously, until morning. Perhaps you will wake briefly while to use the bathroom, to adjust your covers, to check your phone with the guilty reflexive compulsion of the modern human. But your basic expectation, the assumption so deeply embedded that it does not feel like an assumption at all, is that sleep is a single, continuous event. You go under, you stay under, you come back up. The night is one long, unbroken passage from consciousness to morning. This assumption is wrong, or rather, it is historically very unusual. And the fact that it feels so natural, so obvious, so simply the way sleep works is itself a fascinating piece of evidence about how profoundly the Industrial Revolution reshaped human biology, or rather, human biology's relationship with light and time and the social organization of the night. For most of human history, and specifically for the medieval people whose sleeping culture you have been inhabiting tonight, sleep was not one thing. It was two things, two distinct periods of sleep, separated by an interval of wakefulness in the middle of the night that was so normal, so expected, so built into the structure of daily life that the medieval and early modern literature references it with the casual matter-of-factness of people describing something that requires no explanation, because everyone already knows what you are talking about. They called it first sleep and second sleep. In Latin, prima somnus and secunda somnus. In Middle English, the first sleep and the morn sleep, or simply the first sleep and the second. The terms appear in medical texts, in literary works, in household management literature, in devotional writing, in the kind of practical, everyday language that people use for things they encounter every day, not as curiosities, not as exceptions, as the standard structure of the night. The pattern worked roughly like this. Shortly after dark, and in a world without artificial lighting, dark came early and was genuinely dark in ways that modern urban life never experiences. People went to their first sleep. This first sleep lasted somewhere between 4 and 5 hours, after which they woke naturally in the middle of the night, alert and relatively clear-headed in the way that a body waking after completing a full sleep cycle often is. This waking period lasted approximately an hour, sometimes longer. Then the second sleep began and continued until morning. The middle of the night waking interval was not experienced as insomnia. It was not the anxious, frustrated, ceiling-staring wakefulness of the modern person who expects to be asleep and is not. It was simply wakefulness. Normal, expected, unremarkable wakefulness in the middle of the night, and it had a character and a set of associated activities that were entirely its own. What did people do during this interval? The evidence, drawn from the scattered references, In literature, household accounts and devotional writing suggests a range of activities that reflect the specific quality of that middle-of-the-night consciousness. Quiet, private, neither fully of the day nor of the sleep, a liminal hour that invited a particular kind of reflection and activity. Prayer was the most commonly recommended use of the interval, particularly in the devotional literature addressed to lay people who were trying to structure their spiritual lives along quasi-monastic lines. The night office matins was sung by monks in the middle of the night precisely because this waking interval was understood as a spiritually significant time, a thin place in the night when the soul was unusually open to divine communication. Lay people who could not attend a monastic night office were advised to use their natural waking interval for private prayer, for meditation, for the examination of conscience that prepared the soul for the second sleep and for the day ahead. But the interval was used for many other things too, in the less devotionally structured households that made up most of medieval society. Couples talked. The middle-of-the-night conversation, in the privacy of a curtained bed or the quiet of a shared room, was understood as a particular kind of intimate communication, relaxed, unguarded, occurring in that soft, cognitive state, between one sleep and the next in which defenses were down and honesty came more easily. Medical literature noted that this interval was a good time for marital relations, the body being rested from the day's exertions but not yet fully committed to the second sleep. Household tasks that required quiet and minimal light, mending, thinking, planning, were sometimes accomplished in this interval by people who found the brief waking period a natural opportunity for gentle activity. Now here is where the two-sleep structure connects directly to the sleeping upright question in a way that illuminates both. The transition between first sleep and the waking interval, and between the waking interval and second sleep, was facilitated by the inclined sleeping position in ways that made the whole structure more functional. Rising from an inclined sleeping position for the middle-of-the-night waking interval was easier, more natural, and less disruptive than rising from a fully horizontal position. The inclined sleeper was already partially upright. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was gentler, the body already oriented toward the vertical rather than having to haul itself up from complete horizontality. This ergonomic relationship between the two sleep structure and the inclined sleeping position was probably not the reason medieval people slept inclined. The medical, theological, and architectural reasons we have already discussed were doing most of that work. But it was a functional compatibility that reinforced the practice. The sleeping arrangement that medicine recommended and theology endorsed also happened to work extremely well with the biphasic sleep pattern that was simply how human nights were structured. There is a wonderfully odd detail in the medical literature of the period, which is the specific advice about how to use the waking interval between first and second sleep for health optimization. Some physicians recommended this interval as an ideal time for certain bodily functions. The evacuation of waste that had accumulated during the first sleep, the taking of light food or drink if the body required it, and in some texts, the adjustment of sleeping position for the second sleep, which might be different from the position used for the first. The night was, in this medical understanding, not a single event requiring a single positional prescription, but a two-part process in which the body's needs might legitimately shift between the first and second sleep. The scholar Roger Ekirch, whose research brought the historical reality of biphasic sleep to widespread modern attention in the early 2000s, argues that the disappearance of the two-sleep pattern is directly linked to the spread of artificial lighting in the 18th and 19th centuries, which extended the waking day, compressed the sleeping night, and gradually trained human sleep into the monophasic pattern we now consider normal. Scholars still argue about the extent to which biphasic sleep was truly universal across all human cultures, or whether it was more specifically a feature of pre-industrial northern European winters, where nights were long enough to accommodate the pattern most naturally, but the evidence for its widespread presence in medieval European life is substantial and consistent. What is most striking from the perspective of tonight's journey is that the two-sleep structure meant that medieval nights had a middle, a genuine, lived, conscious middle, in which the sleeping person was awake in the darkness, aware of the night around them, and then chose to return to sleep. The night was not a passage to be crossed unconsciously. It was an inhabited space with its own activities and its own quality of time. The inclined sleeper, waking in the middle of that inhabited night, adjusted their bolsters, said their prayers, perhaps spoke quietly to the person beside them, and then settled back against the familiar angle of their sleeping arrangement and let the second sleep come. The night had a shape, it had a middle, and sleeping upright made navigating that shape, rising from it, returning to it, as natural as breathing. Your night has no middle. It is a straight line from one edge to the other, unbroken, continuous, modern, but somewhere, in the oldest part of your brain, the part that predates electricity and the Industrial Revolution and the compression of human sleep into a single, efficient block, there might be a memory of that middle, that quiet waking hour, that peculiar, soft, liminal consciousness in the middle of the dark. If you wake tonight, unexpectedly, at 2 or 3 in the morning, and find yourself oddly alert, not anxious, just awake, now you know what that is. That is the first sleep finishing. That is your medieval brain looking for its interval. You are in the waking interval now, that quiet middle hour of the medieval night. And something is shifting at the edges of your consciousness in the way that things shift when the rational mind has loosened its grip but not entirely let go. The fire has burned down to coals. The room is breathing around you with the slow respiration of sleeping bodies. And somewhere in the soft, receptive space between your first sleep and your second, something comes to you. An image, a voice, a sequence of events with their own internal logic, vivid and strange and somehow more real than the stone walls and cold air of the room you are lying in. You are dreaming. Or you were dreaming, and now you are in that liminal place where the dream is still present, still warm and near, still available for examination before the waking world dissolves it entirely. In the medieval world, you would not let it dissolve. You would hold it. You would turn it over carefully in the quiet of your waking interval, examine its details, try to read its meaning, because what had just happened in your sleeping mind was not the random neural static that modern neuroscience describes. It was a communication, a message, possibly from God, possibly from a demon, possibly from your own body, speaking in the symbolic language that the sleeping imagination used when the rational mind was not there to interrupt. Dreams in medieval Europe were taken with a seriousness that the modern world has almost entirely abandoned. And the system of dream interpretation that medieval thinkers developed was sophisticated, internally coherent, and directly connected to the question of sleeping posture in ways that make the whole picture of medieval sleep culture suddenly snap into focus. The medieval understanding of dreams drew on several converging traditions. From the ancient world came the basic taxonomy of dream types, most influentially, the system described by Macrobius in his commentary on the Dream of Scipio, which identified 5 categories of nocturnal experience. The somnium, a true dream, requiring interpretation. The visio, a prophetic vision showing future events directly. The oraculum, in which a divine or authoritative figure appeared to deliver a message. The insomnium, a meaningless dream produced by physical or emotional disturbance, and the visum, a frightening apparition at the threshold of sleep. This taxonomy was absorbed into medieval Christian thought and elaborated upon by theologians who added the crucial question of divine versus demonic origin, which category a given dream fell into, and what that meant for the dreamer. The medical tradition contributed the humoral theory of dream causation, which we have touched on earlier in tonight's journey, but which deserves fuller attention here. Dreams, in the humoral framework, were produced by the imagination, that specific faculty of the soul, located in the middle ventricle of the brain, operating on the impressions and memories stored there, while the rational mind was inactive during sleep. The quality of those dreams was directly influenced by the state of the humors. An excess of blood produced vivid, active, emotionally intense dreams. An excess of yellow bile produced angry, fiery, disturbing dreams. An excess of black bile produced fearful, melancholic, terrifying dreams. An excess of phlegm produced dull, watery, incoherent dreams. And the humoral state of the brain during sleep was, here is the connection you have been waiting for, directly influenced by sleeping posture. The pooling of corrupt vapors in the posterior ventricle of the brain, which we discussed in relation to both demonic interference and medical theory, was the mechanism by which the wrong sleeping posture produced the wrong kind of dreams. Body lying flat, head unelevated, corrupt vapors rising freely from an improperly concocting stomach produced an overheated, vapor-saturated brain environment that was specifically associated with the most disturbing and potentially demonic categories of dream. The bilious excess that the flat position encouraged was the raw material of nightmares. The inclined sleeping position, by keeping the head elevated and reducing the pooling of corrupt vapors, produced a cleaner brain environment, cooler, less congested, more receptive to the kind of organized, meaningful, potentially divine communication that the somnium and visio categories represented. You slept inclined not just to protect your digestion or avoid the night hag or maintain your spiritual composure. You slept inclined to have better dreams, more meaningful dreams, dreams that might tell you something true about yourself, your future, or the will of God, rather than the corrupt, disturbing, demonic noise that the flat, sleeping position was understood to generate. This connection between posture and dream quality was not a peripheral detail in medieval medical and theological writing. It was central. The whole elaborate system of dream interpretation that medieval culture developed depended on the assumption that some dreams were meaningful and others were not, that some were of divine origin and others of demonic origin, and that the factors which determined which kind you received included, among diet, emotional state, spiritual preparation, and the state of your humors, the angle at which you had arranged your body for the night. The practical consequences of this belief were real and observable. People who experienced persistently disturbing dreams, nightmares, demonic visitations, the kind of nocturnal terror that left them exhausted and spiritually troubled, were advised by both their physicians and their confessors to examine their sleeping arrangements. Were they sleeping flat? Were their bolsters insufficient? Was the head adequately elevated? The troubling dream was diagnostic evidence of a postural problem, and the postural correction was part of the treatment. There is a wonderfully specific, quirky detail in some of the dream interpretation manuals of the period, the Unera Critica, that circulated in both learned and popular versions, which is the instruction to consider your physical state and sleeping position before attempting to interpret a dream. A dream dreamed in the correct inclined position after appropriate spiritual preparation and in a state of humoral balance was a dream worth interpreting. A dream dreamed flat after a heavy meal and without the evening prayers in a state of bilious excess was almost certainly an insomnium, meaningless, produced by physical disturbance. And attempting to read prophetic meaning into it was not just a waste of time but potentially a spiritual error, since the demonic could dress its corruptions in the appearance of meaningful communication. The relationship between posture and dream quality also had a social dimension that is worth noting. The ability to have meaningful interpretable dreams, the somnium, the visio, the oraculum, was understood as a spiritual privilege that required the correct conditions, and the correct conditions included the correct sleeping arrangement. Kings and saints dreamed prophetically. Their dreams were recorded, discussed, acted upon. The dreams of the poorly nourished, improperly arranged, cold-floor peasant were, in this framework, less likely to carry divine communication. Not because God could not speak to peasants, But because the physical and spiritual conditions required for the reception of genuine dream communication were conditions that poverty and cold and insufficient bolsters made difficult to achieve, scholars still argue about the extent to which medieval dream theory was genuinely believed as a literal account of nocturnal communication versus the extent to which it functioned as a cultural framework for processing and giving meaning to the universally human experience of vivid and sometimes terrifying dreams. But the behavioral consequences were real regardless of the underlying ontology. People arranged themselves carefully for sleep because they wanted to dream correctly. They prepared their spiritual state before bed because they wanted their dreams to be receivable. They elevated their heads and maintained their inclines because the alternative was corrupt vapors and demonic imagery, and the kind of night that left the morning self diminished and troubled. Your dreams tonight are your own business. Modern neuroscience has its own account of what they are and where they come from, and it does not involve corrupt vapors or the angle of your bolsters or the question of divine versus demonic origin. But the medieval insight that what happens in your sleeping mind is influenced by the state of your body, that your physical arrangement for sleep, your diet, your emotional state as you enter the night, all shape the quality of what the sleeping mind produces, then is not entirely wrong. You are sleeping flat, and your dreams will be whatever they will be, unsupervised by any postural protocol. But if tonight's dream is strange and vivid and a little disturbing, and you wake from it with that particular medieval feeling of having been somewhere real, consider your angle. There is a category of medieval person whose sleeping arrangements were subject to more external supervision, more specific prescription, more detailed and anxious attention than almost anyone else in the society, more than the king with his ceremonial coacher, more than the monk with his rule-governed night, more than the merchant carefully following his physician's humoral advice. This category of person had their sleep discussed in medical texts, in household management literature, in the advice of midwives and learned physicians, and experienced older women who had navigated the same territory themselves. Their posture during sleep was considered a matter not just of personal health, but of the survival of the next generation, the continuation of the family, and in the grandest cases, the succession of dynasties. We are talking about women, and more specifically about pregnant women whose sleeping bodies became, in the medieval imagination, one of the most medically and socially loaded subjects in the entire literature of sleep. The medieval understanding of female physiology was built on the same humoral foundation as everything else in medieval medicine, but with a set of gender-specific modifications that reflected the Galenic inheritance filtered through centuries of predominantly male medical commentary. Women, in this framework, were understood as fundamentally colder and wetter than men, their bodies running on a cooler, more phlegmatic constitution that had implications for nearly every aspect of their health, including their sleep. The colder female constitution meant that women were considered more susceptible to the accumulation of cold, wet humors during sleep, more prone to the phlegmatic excess that a poorly arranged night produced, and in need of specific positional guidance to counteract these tendencies. But it was pregnancy that brought the sharpest medical focus on female sleeping posture, because pregnancy introduced a new variable into the humoral calculus, a second body, or rather a developing body, nested within the first, sensitive to everything the mother experienced, shaped by everything she did, eating what she ate and breathing what she breathed, and, by the medical understanding of the era, significantly influenced by how she positioned herself during the long hours of sleep. The medical literature on pregnant sleep was specific, sometimes startlingly so. The flat supine position was warned against with particular emphasis for pregnant women, and the reasons went beyond the standard anti-flat arguments about corrupt vapors and demonic visitation, though those applied equally here. The specific concern for the pregnant woman lying flat was the weight and position of the uterus, understood in medieval anatomy as a relatively mobile organ, capable of shifting position within the body in ways that could compress surrounding structures, disrupt the flow of blood and nourishment to the developing child, and in the worst cases cause the miscarriage or malformation that medieval parents, facing an infant mortality rate we can barely imagine, feared above almost all other outcomes. The uterus lying heavy on the major blood vessels of the back, in the flat supine position, was understood to impede the circulation that nourished the fetus. The corrupt vapors that rose to the brain, in any flat sleeper, rose with particular danger to the pregnant woman, whose imagination was considered especially active and especially influential over the developing child inside her. The doctrine of maternal imagination, the belief that strong impressions on the pregnant woman's mind could physically shape the fetus she carried, was one of the most persistent and widely held beliefs in medieval medical thought, and it meant that the quality of the pregnant woman's dreams was not just her own concern, but a matter of fetal welfare. A pregnant woman, sleeping flat, generating corrupt vapors, experiencing disturbed and potentially demonic dreams, with her overheated imagination working on the developing child inside her. This was, in the medieval medical imagination, a scenario of genuine danger. The inclined sleeping position was therefore prescribed for pregnant women with even more urgency than for the general population, because the stakes of getting it wrong were understood to extend beyond the mother herself to the child she carried. The specific recommendations varied across different medical traditions and texts. Some physicians advised the left side, specifically in the later stages of pregnancy, arguing that this positioned the heavier part of the gravid uterus away from the major vessels and distributed its weight more safely. Others recommended alternating sides through the night, with the transition between first and second sleep providing a natural opportunity to shift position. Almost all agreed that the flat supine position should be avoided, particularly in the final trimester, when the weight of the developed fetus made its pressure on maternal structures most significant. The advice was delivered not just through formal medical texts, but through the practical oral tradition of midwifery, that dense network of experienced women's knowledge that operated largely outside the formal medical establishment, but which carried enormous authority in the everyday reality of pregnancy and birth. The midwife who attended a birth had usually been present at dozens or hundreds of others, and her accumulated practical knowledge about what worked, what caused harm, what the women who had good outcomes had done, and what the women who had bad outcomes had done differently, was distilled into the kind of specific, actionable advice that spread through communities of women in ways that formal medical texts, written in Latin and accessible only to the educated, could never reach. There is a genuinely touching, quirky detail in some of the vernacular advice literature directed at pregnant women, the kind of practical guides written in the local language rather than Latin, intended for literate women who were managing their own pregnancies, which is the extended and sometimes very tender discussion of how to arrange the sleeping space for maximum comfort and safety in the later stages of pregnancy. The advice about bolster placement, about how to support the growing abdomen, about which side to favor and when to shift, and how to manage the increasing difficulty of finding any comfortable position at all in the final weeks. This reads less like medical prescription and more like the voice of someone who has been there, who knows what those nights feel like and who is trying to help. The social dimension of female sleeping arrangements in pregnancy extended to the question of bed sharing, which was the normal condition of most medieval sleeping but which acquired additional significance during pregnancy. A pregnant woman sharing a bed with her husband, with other family members, or with servants was subject to the movements and pressures of those other bodies in ways that the medical literature noted with concern. The rolling of a sleeping partner, the pressure of another body against the pregnant abdomen, the disruption of carefully arranged bolsters by someone else's restlessness. These were practical problems that the more detailed household advice literature addressed, with recommendations for creating a protected sleeping space within the shared bed, a territory of bolsters and positioning that maintained the pregnant woman's prescribed incline despite the communal nature of the sleeping arrangement. Scholars still argue about how much of the medieval medical advice about pregnant sleep reflected genuine clinical observation versus how much it was theoretical elaboration on humoral principles that had no direct empirical foundation, but the underlying instinct that pregnant sleep deserves special attention, that the position of a pregnant body during sleep has real consequences for both mother and child, is one that modern obstetrics has validated in its own terms. The recommendation that pregnant women avoid the flat supine position in the later stages of pregnancy particularly maps onto current obstetric guidance about the weight of the gravid uterus on the inferior vena cava with an accuracy that is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that careful observation of pregnant women over many centuries produced genuinely useful knowledge even within a theoretically incorrect framework. The medieval pregnant woman, arranged against her bolsters in the prescribed incline, managing the uncomfortable negotiation between her body's needs and the communal sleeping space around her, navigating her physician's advice and her midwife's wisdom, and her own accumulated experience of previous nights, was doing something that looks, from a certain angle, surprisingly like what a modern obstetrician might recommend. The theory was wrong. The instinct was right. And the woman in the bed, adjusting her bolsters in the middle of the medieval night, probably knew more about what her body needed than any of the texts written about her. There is a particular vulnerability in smallness, in the way a new body arrives in the world complete and yet unfinished, dependent in ways that no other creature is dependent for quite so long, requiring not just food and warmth, but the constant, attentive management of every condition surrounding it: temperature, position, surface covering, proximity to other bodies, because it cannot manage any of these things itself, and the consequences of getting them wrong are immediate and sometimes irreversible. Medieval parents knew this vulnerability with an intimacy that their modern counterparts, surrounded by safety guidelines and pediatric research and infant monitoring technology, can barely imagine. They knew it because they watched children die, not as a statistical abstraction, but as a personal, repeated, devastating reality that shaped every decision made about the care of the very young, with a combination of fierce protectiveness and deep, experienced fear. The medieval infant's night was one of the most carefully managed, most anxiously supervised, and most theoretically elaborated subjects in the entire literature of medieval childcare. How the infant slept, where, on what surface, in what position, covered by what, near whom, at what temperature, was a matter of medical prescription, folk tradition, religious observance, and the accumulated practical wisdom of women who had kept children alive through medieval winters and knew, in the detailed, specific, non-theoretical way, of people who have done something many times, what worked and what did not. The swaddling cloth was the foundational technology of medieval infant care, and it is worth spending a moment with it because it shaped the infant's sleeping position more completely than any bolster arrangement or architectural feature shaped the adult's. Swaddling, the tight wrapping of an infant's body in long strips of cloth, binding the arms to the sides, the legs straight and together, the whole small body enclosed in a firm, supportive cocoon, was the universal practice of medieval European infant care, and it was not considered a restraint in the modern sense of that word. It was considered a kindness, a medical necessity, a protection. The rationale for swaddling drew on multiple converging beliefs. The humoral tradition held that the newborn body was extremely wet and soft, its limbs not yet firm enough to maintain their correct shape without external support, and that without the guidance of swaddling bands, the infant's limbs might grow crooked, bent, or malformed. This was not a trivial concern in a world where physical deformity had serious consequences for a person's ability to work, marry, and survive. The swaddling cloth was understood as a kind of external skeleton, providing the structural support that the infant's own body was not yet able to provide for itself. Folk tradition added the belief that swaddled infants were safer from the various supernatural dangers that threatened the very young: fairies, changelings, the evil eye, the various malevolent entities that medieval belief held to be specifically interested in new and unbaptized life. The enclosed, tightly wrapped body was a body that presented fewer gaps, fewer openings, fewer points of vulnerability to supernatural interference. The swaddling cloth was spiritual armor as well as physical support. The sleeping position that swaddling produced was, by the nature of the practice, not horizontal in the modern infant sleep sense. A swaddled infant could be placed in various positions, but the common practice in many medieval households was to prop the swaddled baby upright or at a significant incline, supported in a cradle, a basket, or in the arms of a nurse or mother, in a position that kept the head elevated and the face clear. The concern about suffocation, about the infant's face being covered or pressed against a surface, was real and present in medieval childcare literature, even if the understanding of its mechanism differed from modern SIDS research. The cradle itself was designed with the inclined position in mind. Medieval cradles, as depicted in illuminated manuscripts and described in household inventories, were typically built with a curved or hooded end that supported and elevated the infant's head, creating a natural incline in the sleeping surface. The hood of the cradle served multiple purposes. It protected the infant's head from drafts. It provided a sense of enclosure that was considered calming, and it structurally enforced the elevated head position that both medicine and folk tradition recommended. The rocking motion of the cradle was understood in the medical literature as a digestive aid, the gentle rhythmic movement assisting the infant's immature concoction process in the same way that the inclined position assisted the adults, and the combination of rocking and inclination was considered the optimal sleeping environment for the very young. Wet nurses, who were employed in wealthy households to feed and tend infants, were specifically instructed in the correct management of the cradle, the correct angle of inclination, and the correct frequency and duration of rocking in household management texts that treated these as professional competencies requiring explicit guidance. There is a genuinely heartbreaking dimension to the medieval literature on infant sleep that sits alongside the practical and medical detail, and it is the ever-present shadow of infant death. The fear that the sleeping infant might not wake, that the small, vulnerable, swaddled body lying in its cradle might simply stop, was a constant presence in the emotional landscape of medieval parenthood. This fear expressed itself in specific practices designed to protect the sleeping infant, from the prayers said over the cradle at night to the religious objects placed within or near it, from the careful instructions about not leaving the infant unattended to the detailed guidance about not allowing anyone to sleep in the same bed as the infant. That last concern, the danger of overlying of an adult or older child rolling onto or pressing against the sleeping infant, appears in medieval childcare literature with a frequency and urgency that reflects genuine empirical knowledge about a real danger. The Church weighed in on this question specifically with pastoral advice and in some cases explicit prohibitions against taking infants into the parental bed, driven partly by the documented reality of infant deaths attributed to overlying and partly by a more complex moral and social anxiety about the shared adult bed as an inappropriate environment for the infant body. The quirky detail here is the medieval legal dimension of infant death during shared sleeping. Cases in which the death of an infant in a shared bed produced genuine legal and ecclesiastical proceedings to determine whether the death was accidental or negligent, and what the spiritual and legal consequences for the surviving adults should be. The records of these cases, scattered through ecclesiastical court documents and coroners' rolls, are among the most intimate and painful documents in the medieval archive. Small tragedies recorded in the formal language of institutional inquiry, the gap between the legal language and the human reality behind it almost unbridgeable. The swaddled, cradle-inclined, carefully positioned medieval infant was the object of an anxious love expressed through positional management in exactly the way that the adult sleeper was the object of theological and medical management. The angle of rest was a way of caring, a way of protecting, a statement that you had done everything within your knowledge and means to keep this small, vulnerable, sleeping body safe through the night. Scholars still argue about the actual safety outcomes of medieval swaddling practices, whether the tight binding caused developmental problems that offset whatever protective benefits it provided, whether the elevated cradle position reduced or increased certain risks. But the intention behind every carefully arranged swaddling band and every correctly inclined cradle was the same intention that drives the modern parent who gets up 3 times in the night to check the baby monitor. Keep the small ones safe. Keep the angle right. Keep the night from taking what the day gave you. You have been moving through the medieval night with a growing sense of its population, the demons and the physicians and the priests and the kings and the exhausted peasants and the carefully swaddled infants. And now you are going to add a few more bodies to the picture, because the medieval sleeping space was even more crowded than you might have realized, and the hierarchy of who slept where, on what surface, under what covering, and in proximity to whom reveals something about medieval society that is simultaneously pragmatic, intimate, occasionally absurd, and deeply human. The medieval bed at every social level above the bare floor was a shared space. Not occasionally, not as an emergency measure, not as the temporary compromise of travelers forced by circumstance into reluctant proximity. Routinely, normally, as the expected and unremarkable default of medieval sleeping culture at every level of society except the very highest, and even there, as we have seen, the royal bedchamber was crowded with attendants, if not always with fellow sleepers. Bed sharing in the medieval world was not primarily a social or emotional practice, though it had social and emotional dimensions. It was primarily a thermal one. Heat was expensive in fuel, in labor, in the physical infrastructure required to generate and retain it. And human bodies were free heat sources that were already present and already warm. The logic of sleeping together was the logic of any sensible system for managing scarce resources. You pooled what you had, you shared what generated warmth. You arranged yourselves in the configuration that kept the most bodies at the most survivable temperature through the coldest hours. The hierarchy of who shared beds with whom was a precise social map, and reading it tells you almost everything you need to know about the relationships and power structures of a medieval household. At the top, in the grandest establishments, the lord and lady slept together in the great bed, attended by body servants, sleeping on pallets at the foot of the bed or just outside the bed curtains, close enough to be summoned, far enough to maintain the fiction of privacy that the curtains were designed to create. The children of the household slept in the nursery under the care of a nurse or governess. Household servants of middling rank slept in the hall or in the chambers adjacent to the spaces they served, on pallets or on the benches that lined the walls. In the merchant household, the configuration was compressed but similarly structured. The master and mistress in the household bed, the apprentices and journeymen in the hall or the workshop, the domestic servants in the kitchen or on the landing outside the master's chamber. In the peasant household, the compression was complete. Everyone in the same space, the configuration determined entirely by warmth and relationship rather than by any architectural separation of rank. The guests who arrived at an inn, a monastery, or a private household in need of accommodation entered a sleeping culture that had no concept of the private single room as a default hospitality offering. Inns provided beds, not rooms, and a bed meant a shared bed, a surface large enough for several people in which the traveler might find themselves sleeping beside strangers of varying degrees of compatibility, cleanliness, and nocturnal habit. The literature of medieval travel is full of the comedy and discomfort of shared-in beds, the snoring neighbor, the restless companion, the person who took more than their share of the coverlet, the bedfellow whose nocturnal habits were best, encountered only once. Now add the animals, because the animals were genuinely present in medieval sleeping spaces, and their presence shaped the sleeping culture in ways that are easy to overlook. We have already noted the animals in the peasant longhouse, the cow, the pig, the goats sharing the lower end of the structure. But the animal presence in sleeping spaces extended up the social hierarchy in ways that reflect the different functions animals served and the different attitudes toward animal proximity that medieval culture held. Dogs were the most universal sleeping companions across social levels. Working dogs, hunting dogs, herding dogs, guard dogs were valuable assets whose welfare was taken seriously, and in many households they slept inside, near the fire, in the same space as the human sleepers. In the great hall of a castle or manor house, dogs were simply part of the sleeping population, sprawled near the hearth or tucked under benches, as much a feature of the nighttime environment as the sleeping servants and the dying fire. In peasant households, a dog near the bed was a practical security measure as well as a source of warmth. The dog that barked at an intruder was doing a job that justified its presence and its share of the communal warmth. Cats occupied a different, ecological niche in the medieval sleeping space, present for practical purposes of rodent control, less likely to be consciously included in sleeping arrangements, but often present anyway, finding their own warm spots among the sleeping bodies, with the serene self-interest that is characteristic of their species. The medieval cat in the sleeping space was doing what medieval cats did, managing the grain stores and food supplies that fed the household, and incidentally, keeping the sleeping human bodies company in the way that small, warm animals do when left to their own devices. The quirky detail here, which appears in enough sources to be taken as genuine rather than literary exaggeration, is the occasional presence of larger and less conventionally domestic animals in the sleeping spaces of the very poor. Accounts from cold winters mention households in which goats or small pigs were brought into the sleeping area, not just for their own shelter, but for the warmth their bodies generated. A fully grown pig produces meaningful amounts of body heat and was, in the calculus of a freezing medieval winter night, a legitimate contributor to the thermal economy of the sleeping space. The pig did not care about sleeping posture. The pig simply generated warmth, which was its primary virtue in this context. The human sharing arrangements had their own complexity and their own rules, and the rules were not just social but increasingly, in the later medieval period, legal and ecclesiastical. We have already encountered the church's concern about infants being overlain in shared beds, but the church also had views about other aspects of shared sleeping, about the mixing of unrelated men and women in sleeping spaces, about the conditions under which shared beds were acceptable and those under which they were not, about the spiritual risks of nocturnal proximity to persons of the wrong degree of relationship or the wrong spiritual state. The inn-bed, with its random assortment of travelers, was a particular site of ecclesiastical and social anxiety about inappropriate sleeping proximity, and the literature of pilgrimage and travel records numerous episodes in which shared sleeping arrangements produced complications, romantic, financial, comedic, or genuinely dangerous, that the participants had not anticipated when they lay down beside a stranger in the dark. Scholars still argue about how to weigh the evidence for medieval bed-sharing culture, whether the literary and legal sources, which tend to record the exceptional and problematic rather than the routine, give us an accurate picture of how common and how comfortable shared sleeping actually was, or whether the comedy and scandal in the sources represents the outlier, rather than the norm of an experience that was usually simply unremarkable. What is clear is that the medieval sleeper was almost never truly alone. The sleeping self was always embedded in a web of other sleeping selves, in a family, servants, guests, animals, and the management of that shared space, the negotiation of warmth and surface, and covering and noise and smell, was as much a part of the sleeping experience as the dreams and the posture and the theological anxiety about the angle of the body. Your solitary bed in your private room, with its one human body and its absence of livestock, is a historically extraordinary situation. The medieval night was warmer than that. It was louder than that. It smelled considerably more interesting than that. And it was, in its crowded, complicated, hierarchically organized, occasionally pig-assisted way, a more communal experience of unconsciousness than anything your modern sleeping life contains. There is an image that every medieval European carried in their mind with the kind of clarity and immediacy that we reserve for things we have seen many times, in many contexts, from childhood onward. It was not a frightening image exactly, though it carried weight. It was simply a familiar one, encountered in churches and in manuscripts and in the domestic reality of households where death was a visitor regular enough to be recognized, if never entirely welcomed. The image was a human body laid out flat, arms at the sides or crossed on the chest, face aimed upward, eyes closed, completely, definitively, irrevocably horizontal. You know what that image is. You recognized it the moment I described it, even before I name it, because the visual vocabulary of death has not changed that much in 1,000 years. The supine body is still how we lay out our dead. The flat, upward-facing human form is still the universal iconography of mortality, carved into tomb monuments and painted on funeral cards and described in every language's vocabulary for the moment when a living person becomes a body. In the medieval world, this image was everywhere. It was in the church you entered every Sunday, carved into the floor tiles underfoot and mounted on the walls around you. The effigies of the noble dead, their stone bodies lying flat and still in permanent sculptural sleep, their hands folded, their faces composed, their whole carved existence a meditation on the posture of death. It was in the illuminated manuscripts that educated people read and looked at, where death scenes and burial preparations were depicted with the loving detail that medieval art brought to every subject it considered worth portraying. It was in the domestic reality of the household, where death came with sufficient frequency, that most medieval adults had personally prepared a body for burial, had seen the flat laying out, had participated in the ritual arrangement of a dead person into the supine position that prepared them for their journey. The association between horizontal sleep and death was not, in the medieval mind, a metaphor. It was not a poetic comparison, a literary flourish, a rhetorical way of saying that sleep is restful like death. It was a genuine, felt, pervasive, symbolic identification that shaped behavior in ways both conscious and unconscious, both prescribed and instinctive. When a medieval person lay down flat in the darkness, they were, at some level, of cultural awareness, assuming the position of the dead. And the dead, in the medieval cosmological understanding, were in a specific and serious relationship with the forces of the night that made their posture something the living wanted to approach with care. The connection ran in both directions. Death borrowed the imagery of sleep. The dead were said to be sleeping, to be resting, to be at peace in the language of comfort and consolation. And sleep borrowed the imagery of death. The flat-lying sleeper in the dark was, visually and symbolically, doing something that rhymed uncomfortably with the flat-lying corpse in its shroud. The medieval mind held both of these connections simultaneously, not as a contradiction, but as a genuine theological and experiential truth about the relationship between the two states. Sleep was the little death, death was the long sleep, and the body position they shared was the position that linked them. This symbolic identification had practical consequences for how people thought about and managed their sleeping posture, but it also had a deeper effect on the emotional texture of the medieval night that is harder to quantify but important to acknowledge. The flat-lying sleeper was not just medically at risk, not just spiritually vulnerable, not just architecturally cold and practically uncomfortable. They were, in the visual vocabulary of their culture, enacting mortality. They were rehearsing the position that would one day be imposed on them permanently, and doing so voluntarily, nightly, without the sacramental preparation that would be required for the real thing. The Ars Moriendi, with the art of dying, was one of the most important literary genres of the later medieval period, a body of texts dedicated to teaching Christians how to die well, how to face death with the correct spiritual preparation and the correct posture of the soul. These texts were widely circulated, translated into vernacular languages, adapted for different audiences, and taken seriously by people across the social spectrum. They addressed, among other things, the position of the dying body, the correct way to arrange a person who was approaching death, the prayers to be said, the gestures to be made, the orientation of the body in relation to the sacred. The body of the dying and the dead was oriented with care, the head typically toward the west, feet toward the east, so that at the resurrection the body would rise, facing the direction of the returning Christ. The arms arranged appropriately. The whole physical arrangement of death was a ritual act, with theological significance, and the similarity of that arrangement to the flat sleeping position meant that the flat sleeping position carried, for the medieval mind, a faint but persistent echo of that ritual seriousness. Waking from flat sleep, these when flat sleep occurred, could produce a brief, disorienting moment in which the waking person, flat on their back in the dark, face aimed at the ceiling, experienced a flash of the death posture before consciousness fully reasserted itself and re-established the difference between sleeping and dying. Sleep paralysis, which we discussed early in our journey as the physiological basis for the night hag experience, would have been particularly terrifying in this context. To wake unable to move, flat on one's back, in the position of the dead, in the dark, was to experience, however briefly, a simulation of death so complete that no amount of intellectual sophistication about neurological states could entirely dispel its emotional force. There is a genuinely strange, quirky detail in some of the more elaborate medieval tomb monuments, which is the existence of the transi tomb, a double-decker monument in which the upper level showed the deceased as they had been in life, carved in full regalia and dignity, and the lower level showed the same person as a decomposing corpse, rendered in sometimes extraordinary anatomical detail, worms and all. These monuments, which appear in significant numbers from the 14th century onward, were not expressions of morbid despair, but of a theological point about the relationship between worldly dignity and physical mortality. The reminder, carved in stone, that the magnificent figure above and the decomposing body below were the same person, that the posture of death awaited the posture of life. The transi tomb's lower figure was, of course, flat, supine, horizontal, in the position that sleeping culture had been nervously avoiding for centuries, because that position was where you ended up, ultimately and permanently, and the medieval mind saw no reason to practice it more than strictly necessary. Scholars still argue about the cultural trajectory of the transi tomb, and what its appearance and spread in the later medieval period tells us about changing attitudes toward death, the body, and the relationship between physical and spiritual identity. Whether it represented a darkening of medieval attitudes toward mortality or simply a new form of the memento mori tradition that had always been present in Christian culture, but the flat, supine, unavoidable position of the carved dead body was consistent throughout. You are lying flat right now. You are in the position that medieval culture loaded with the symbolism of death, that the physicians warned against, that the church found theologically fraught, that the folk tradition associated with nocturnal terror. And you are fine. You are warm and modern and scientifically unbothered by corrupt vapors or demonic access or the symbolic resonance of your sleeping angle. But somewhere in the very long history of what it means to be a human body, in the dark, the flat position carries weight. It has always carried weight. The stone effigies knew it. The physicians knew it. The terrified night hag survivors knew it. Sleep, in the medieval imagination, was always haunted by its resemblance to the other thing. The thing that also lay flat. The thing that also closed its eyes. The thing that also went somewhere and did not, in the end, come back. Everything changes slowly and then all at once and then slowly again, and the change is never as clean as the story we tell about it afterward. This is true of political revolutions and technological transformations and cultural shifts of every kind, and it is true of the change in sleeping posture that gradually, unevenly, incompletely, over the course of roughly 3 centuries, moved the sleeping body of Western Europe from its medieval inclined default toward the flat horizontal position that you currently occupy without a second thought. The story of how lying flat became normal is not a single story. It is a braided narrative of changing medicine, changing theology, changing architecture, changing economics, changing light, and changing relationships between the human body and the night, each strand developing at its own pace, in its own context, pulling in the same general direction but never quite synchronized, never producing at a clean before and after moment that you could point to and say, there, that is when it changed, but it did change. And tracing the change tells you as much about the forces that shaped the medieval sleeping world as anything we have discussed so far, because understanding why something stopped happening requires understanding what was holding it in place. The first major strand of change was medical, and it began with the gradual unraveling of the humoral system that had provided the theoretical foundation for the sleeping upright prescription. This unraveling was not sudden. Galenic medicine did not collapse overnight. It eroded, challenged from multiple directions by the new anatomical and physiological knowledge that the Renaissance and the scientific revolution were generating, tested against empirical observation in ways that the medieval university system had rarely demanded, and found increasingly inadequate as a complete account of how the human body actually worked. Andreas Vesalius, publishing his revolutionary anatomical work in 1543, demonstrated through direct dissection that Galen had been wrong about numerous specific anatomical details, not wrong in ways that immediately invalidated the entire humoral system, but wrong in ways that established the principle that received authority was not sufficient, that the body itself had to be consulted, and that what the body revealed might contradict what the text said. William Harvey's demonstration of the circulation of the blood in 1628 was a more fundamental challenge. If blood circulated continuously through a closed system driven by the heart, the entire theory of humors moving and pooling according to posture and the imagined mechanics of concoction and distribution became deeply problematic. These changes in medical theory did not immediately produce changes in sleeping behavior. Medical culture is conservative, and the practical advice embedded in the Regimina Sanitatis tradition persisted long after the theoretical framework that justified it had been undermined. But gradually, through the 17th and 18th centuries, the specific humoral arguments for sleeping inclined lost their authority, and without those arguments, the prescription lost its urgency. If corrupt vapors rising from an improperly concocting stomach were not actually the mechanism of bad dreams and morning headaches, then the angle of the body during sleep was a comfort question rather than a medical one, and on pure comfort grounds, many people found that flat was easier. The second strand of change was architectural, and it was in some ways the most immediately practical. The gradual improvement of domestic heating technology, better chimneys, more efficient fireplaces, eventually the introduction of stoves, made the medieval cold floor sleeping environment progressively less challenging. When the room was genuinely warm, the thermal arguments for sleeping near the fire on a bench, for curling into a heat-retaining inclined huddle, for sharing body warmth in configurations that naturally produced semi-upright postures, all weakened. A warm room made flat sleeping more comfortable in a direct physical way that no amount of medical theory needed to mediate. The improvement of bedding technology ran parallel to the improvement of heating. The gradual increase in the availability of feather mattresses and then, in the early modern period, the development of increasingly sophisticated spring and support systems meant that the flat sleeping body had better physical support than it had previously enjoyed. The medieval flat sleeper on a straw pallet on a cold floor was genuinely uncomfortable in ways that the early modern flat sleeper on a feather mattress in a warmer room was not. Comfort, in the most straightforward physical sense, began to favor the horizontal. The third strand was theological, and it is perhaps the most interesting because it moved in a direction that its medieval predecessor could not have anticipated. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the early 16th century, produced profound changes in the relationship between the Christian believer and the symbolic world, the that the medieval church had constructed and maintained. The reformers were suspicious of the elaborate symbolic framework that medieval Catholicism had built around every aspect of daily life. The symbolic meaning of gestures and postures, the ritual significance of bodily arrangements, the whole dense network of correspondence between physical acts and spiritual states that had made sleeping posture a theological matter. Protestant theology, in its various forms, tended to locate spiritual significance in faith and scripture rather than in physical gesture and ritual arrangement. The body's posture during sleep in this framework was considerably less theologically loaded than it had been, not spiritually irrelevant, but no longer carrying the specific weight of death symbolism and demonic vulnerability that the medieval framework had assigned it. The flat sleeper was, in increasingly Protestant Northern Europe, simply a sleeping person rather than a person enacting the posture of the corpse in a spiritually dangerous way. There is a wonderfully specific quirky detail in the transition period, roughly the 16th and 17th centuries, which is the persistence of the old postural recommendations in medical and household literature long after their theoretical justifications had been weakened or abandoned. Writers who no longer fully believed in the humoral mechanics of corrupt vapors and pooling bile still recommended inclined sleeping out of what appears to be simple conservatism. The advice was established. It seemed harmless. There was no strong reason to change it, and so it persisted like a fossil in the sediment of popular health literature, its original function forgotten, but its form preserved. The shift in visual culture was perhaps the most eloquent marker of the change. As the Renaissance moved through the 16th century and the early modern period developed its own visual vocabulary, the sleeping figure in art began to change. The inclined sleeper of medieval illuminated manuscripts, propped against bolsters, upper body elevated, clearly arranged in the prescribed posture, gave way to increasingly horizontal sleeping figures. The classical tradition, which Renaissance artists were recovering and celebrating, had its own visual vocabulary for sleep, derived from ancient sculptures of sleeping figures that were often more fully reclined than the medieval tradition allowed. The sleeping figure became more relaxed, more horizontal, more abandoned to unconsciousness, in a visual shift that both reflected and encouraged the same movement in actual sleeping culture. Scholars still argue about the precise timeline and geography of the transition, whether it happened earlier in the more heavily Protestant North, whether it was faster in urban than in rural environments, whether the persistence of folk beliefs about nocturnal dangers maintained the inclined posture in popular culture long after elite medical and theological culture had moved on, but the direction of travel is consistent across the evidence. By the end of the 17th century, in much of Western Europe, the flat sleeping position was becoming the normal one, not universal. The old recommendations persisted in some medical literature, the old fears persisted in folk tradition, the physical constraints of cold and poverty maintained, inclined, sleeping in the households that could not afford the improvements in heating and bedding that made flat sleeping comfortable. But the default was shifting. The long medieval night of inclined, theologically supervised, humorally managed, semi-public sleeping was drawing toward its end. The world was warming slowly in every sense. The rooms were warmer. The theological air was cooler. The medical theory was changing, and the flat, sleeping body, that long-feared posture of the dead, was quietly, gradually becoming just the way people slept. You have traveled a long way tonight. You have moved through cold stone rooms and smoky halls, through the theoretical architecture of humoral medicine and the symbolic weight of theological anxiety, through royal bedchambers and peasant longhouses, and the carefully managed sleeping arrangements of the pregnant, and the swaddled and the hierarchically sorted medieval household. And now, in the penultimate stretch of this journey, you are going to come all the way back to the present, to your body, your bed, your actual current relationship with gravity and sleep. Because it turns out that the medieval conviction that sleeping angle matters has not entirely disappeared. It has simply changed its language. It has traded corrupt vapors and demonic access for clinical terminology and peer-reviewed research, and in doing so it has arrived by a completely different route at some conclusions that would have felt entirely familiar to a Galenic physician or a monastic infirmarian. Modern sleep science has complicated the flat is normal assumption in ways that are worth knowing about, not because they vindicate medieval medicine in any straightforward way, but because they reveal that the question of sleeping position and health is genuinely more interesting than the modern default suggests. Let us start with the most clinically significant area, which is the relationship between sleeping position and breathing. Obstructive sleep apnea, the condition in which the airway partially or fully collapses during sleep, producing pauses in breathing, fragmented sleep, and a cascade of downstream health consequences, including cardiovascular stress, cognitive impairment, and excessive daytime sleepiness, is strongly position-dependent in a significant proportion of sufferers. Positional sleep apnea, as the clinical literature calls it, is the form in which apnea events are substantially more frequent and more severe in the supine position, flat on the back, than in other positions. The mechanism is straightforward. In the supine position, gravity acts on the soft tissues of the throat and the base of the tongue in a way that promotes their collapse into the airway. In the lateral or inclined position, gravity's effect on these tissues changes, and the airway is more likely to remain open. The first-line positional therapy for positional sleep apnea is exactly what you would expect. Avoid the supine position. Sleep on your side, or increasingly, sleep in a mildly inclined position with the head and upper body elevated by 10 to 30 degrees. This last recommendation, skied to the inclined sleeping position as a respiratory therapy, is implemented through exactly the kind of technology that the medieval bolster system was designed to achieve. Wedge pillows, adjustable bed bases, inclined mattress toppers. The modern inclined sleeper managing their sleep apnea with a wedge pillow is using a different theoretical framework and considerably more sophisticated materials than the medieval inclined sleeper managing their corrupt vapors with a bolster arrangement, but the postural principle is identical. The relationship between sleeping position and acid reflux adds another layer to the modern case for inclined sleep. Gastroesophageal reflux disease, the chronic backflow of stomach acid into the esophagus, is significantly worsened by the flat, supine position, in which gravity no longer assists in keeping stomach contents where they belong. The standard clinical recommendation for reflux sufferers is to elevate the head of the bed by 6 to 8 inches, creating a mild incline that uses gravity to reduce reflux events during sleep. The medieval physician who prescribed inclined sleeping as a digestive aid, whose theoretical framework involved vital heat and concoction rather than lower esophageal sphincter function and gastric acid, was observing the same empirical phenomenon through a completely different conceptual lens. The stomach works better in the sleeping body with some gravitational assistance. They were right about that. They were wrong about why. Cardiovascular health adds yet another dimension to the positional story. Research into the relationship between sleeping position and heart function has produced some genuinely interesting findings about the left lateral position, sleeping on the left side, which places the heart in a slightly different relationship to the chest wall and the surrounding structures than other positions. The medieval recommendation to sleep initially on the right side and transition to the left in the middle of the night, driven by the theory that the right side position facilitated drainage from the liver while the left side position served different purposes in the later stages of the digestive process, maps in a loosely suggestive way onto modern research about the cardiovascular implications of different sleeping positions. The mapping is not exact, the mechanisms are completely different, but the attention to lateral position as medically significant is shared. Neurological research has added the most recently discovered layer to the sleeping position story, and it is the one that most directly echoes the medieval concern about what happens in the brain during sleep. The glymphatic system, a waste clearance system in the brain that operates primarily during sleep, flushing metabolic waste products including the amyloid proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease through the brain's interstitial spaces, has been shown in animal studies to function more efficiently in the lateral sleeping position than in the supine or prone positions. If this finding translates to human physiology at clinical scale, and the research is ongoing and the human evidence is not yet conclusive, it would mean that sleeping on your side is better for brain waste clearance than sleeping flat on your back, which is a finding that would have delighted the medieval physician who insisted that the flat position allowed corrupt vapors to pool in the brain with damaging consequences. The corrupt vapors were not real. The glymphatic system is. But both frameworks arrive at the same practical concern. Something happens in the flat-lying brain during sleep that does not happen in the differently positioned brain, and that something has implications for the brain's health. There is a wonderfully resonant, quirky detail in the modern inclined sleep research, which is the use of wedge pillows in post-surgical recovery, specifically in the recovery from spinal surgery, cardiac procedures, and respiratory interventions, where the inclined position serves the same functions that medieval medicine prescribed it for, using gravity to assist bodily processes that the flat position impedes. The hospital bed with its adjustable head elevation, the recovery room wedge pillow, the post-operative instruction to keep the upper body elevated, these are the institutional descendants of the medieval bolster system, shorn of their theological and humoral justifications but serving recognizably similar physiological purposes. Scholars still argue about the extent to which modern positional sleep research has clinical implications broad enough to recommend inclined sleeping as a population-level intervention rather than a specific therapy for identified conditions, and the current medical consensus does not recommend that healthy people without sleep apnea or reflux abandon the flat sleeping position for a medically prescribed incline. The medieval universality of the incline prescription has not been vindicated by modern research, but the medieval intuition that position matters, that the flat, supine body during sleep is not the medically neutral default that the modern world assumes, that the angle of the sleeping body has genuine physiological consequences. That intuition, dressed in its new clinical language, is alive and active in sleep medicine research. You are lying flat. Your glymphatic system is doing whatever it does. Your lower esophageal sphincter is managing on its own. Your airway is open, presumably, because you are still listening to this. The medieval physician would have had notes. The modern sleep researcher might have mild suggestions, but for most people, in most beds, on most nights, the flat position is fine. It is normal. It is what the post-enlightenment, post-humoral, post-theologically anxious human body has settled into as its default resting state. The bolsters are gone. The corrupt vapors have been explained away. The demons have retreated from the clinical literature. And yet the question of angle, the question that medieval medicine answered with bolsters and theology, answered with symbolism and folk tradition, answered with fear, is still, quietly, a question that modern science has not entirely closed. You have come a long way tonight. You left the familiar territory of your own bed and traveled backward through 1,000 years of human sleep, through the cold stone rooms and the smoky halls, through the physicians with their humoral prescriptions, and the priests with their symbolic anxieties, through the royal bedchambers and the peasant longhouses, through the swaddled infants and the shared-in beds, and the pig-assisted thermal economies of medieval winter nights. You have met the night hag, and the incubus and the glymphatic system. You have learned that your sleeping posture was once a matter of state protocol, a subject of theological dispute, a diagnostic indicator of humoral imbalance, and a potential point of demonic access. You have discovered that the flat, horizontal sleeping position you currently occupy without a second thought was, for most of the people whose sleeping lives we have been inhabiting tonight, a posture associated with death, disease, spiritual vulnerability, and a comprehensive failure of personal responsibility toward one's own humors. And now we are here, at the last stretch of tonight's journey, and the story comes back to you. Not to medieval you, not to the cold and theologically anxious and humorally supervised medieval sleeper whose nights we have been inhabiting, but to actual you, in your actual bed, in your actual present, with all of history lying behind you. Like a very long, very crowded, very smoky hallway that ends right here, right now, in this moment of warmth and quiet, and the particular soft darkness of a night you share with nobody or with the people you have chosen, without any ceremonial attendance or theological supervision or physician's prescription about which side to start on. What does it mean to carry all of that history into your current night? It means, first of all, that the thing you are doing right now is lying flat, warm, private, in a bed designed for comfort, in a room designed for sleeping, in a darkness you control, is historically extraordinary. Not in a grandiose way, not in a way that demands gratitude or philosophical reflection every single night, but in the quiet way that things which took a very long time to become possible are extraordinary simply by existing. The private bedroom is a recent invention in the long history of human sleep. The warm room is a recent invention. The flat mattress designed for horizontal sleeping is a recent invention. The darkness you control with a switch is a very recent invention. The solitude, if you have it, is the most recent of all. For most of human history, sleep was communal and cold and supervised and shaped by forces, theological, medical, architectural, social, that had very specific opinions about how you should arrange your body for the night. The freedom to simply lie flat and go to sleep without consulting anyone, without following any prescribed protocol, without worrying about the angle of your bolsters or the state of your humors or the symbolic resonance of your posture, is a freedom that most of the people in tonight's story did not have. It arrived gradually, unevenly, through the long, slow changes in medicine and theology and architecture and economics that we traced in the last section. It is yours now, completely and unremarkably, in the way that freedoms become unremarkable. Once they are fully established, the medieval sleepers whose nights we have inhabited were not foolish. They were not primitive. They were not simply wrong about everything and waiting to be corrected by subsequent centuries. They were human beings navigating genuine uncertainty about the body, the soul, the night, and the invisible world, using the best frameworks available to them and arriving at practical conclusions that served real purposes. Warmth, community, digestive support, respiratory health, psychological comfort in the face of the night's genuine terrors. The bolsters were doing something, the inclined position was doing something, the community of bodies in the shared sleeping space was doing something, the theological framework that gave the night a moral structure was doing something. They were all responses to real conditions, real fears, real biological needs, expressed through the conceptual language of their time. What changed was not the human body's needs. What changed was the framework for understanding and addressing those needs. The corrupt vapors became gastric acid and glymphatic waste. The demonic interference became sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucination. The humoral imbalance became obstructive sleep apnea and positional reflux. The theology of the corpse posture became the cultural aesthetics of a sleeping culture that had renegotiated its relationship with death and the night and the symbolic weight of the supine body. The frameworks changed. The body's need for warmth, for supported breathing, for digestive assistance, for psychological safety in the dark, remained remarkably consistent. There is a thread that runs from the medieval bolster to the modern wedge pillow, from the Galenic prescription for inclined sleep to the clinical recommendation for positional sleep apnea therapy, from the theological concern about the flat body's spiritual vulnerability to the modern awareness that the flat body's airway is genuinely more vulnerable to collapse. The thread is thin in places, broken in others, and the connection is suggestive rather than direct. But it is there. The question of what the sleeping body needs and whether the flat, horizontal position provides it optimally is a question that has been asked in every century since at least the 9th and has not yet received a final answer. Tonight you have slept in some sense through 1,000 years. You have rested in the medieval hall and the royal chamber and the peasant, longhouse and the monastery and the shared in-bed and the carefully managed sick room and the swaddled infant's cradle. You have carried the weight of all those sleeping bodies, all those bolster arrangements, all those theological anxieties and humoral calculations and folk fears and practical thermal economies through the long night of history and back into your own bed. The night hag has not visited. The corrupt vapors have not pooled in your posterior ventricle. Your yellow bile is behaving itself. The demons, if they exist, have found nothing in your posture to interest them. The stone effigies in their churches are lying flat and still, and you are lying flat and still, and the difference between you and them is the one that matters most. You are going to wake up. There is something quietly wonderful about that, about the fact that the flat, horizontal position, that long-feared posture of the dead, has been reclaimed by the living as simply the way the living rest, that the night, stripped of its medieval population of terrors and supervisors and humoral accountants, has become a space of genuine rest, that the darkness you are in right now is yours, warm, private, safe, chosen. Scholars still argue, of course. They always do. About whether biphasic sleep was truly universal, about whether the humoral prescriptions reflected genuine clinical observation, about whether the sleeping upright practice was as widespread as some sources suggest. The arguments are interesting and the uncertainty is real, and the history is genuinely more complicated than any single account can capture. But tonight, in this bed, in this darkness, the arguments are quiet. The history has done what history does at its best. It has made the present strange and therefore visible, shown you the extraordinary in the ordinary, given you a glimpse of how many human nights preceded yours and how different they were, and how much they have in common with the one you are currently inhabiting. You are warm. You are flat. You are alive in the way that flat living people are alive, which is the only way that matters. The medieval night is behind you, long and cold and crowded and full. Your night is here, and it is yours. And it is quiet, and you are. Already, gently, starting to drift. The fire has burned all the way down now. The room is still. Somewhere in the long history of human sleep, 1,000 different nights are quietly resting. The medieval hall with its smoky air and its shared warmth, the royal chamber with its ceremonial bolsters, the peasant bench. By the dying hearth, the monastery with its monks rising for the night office and returning in the soft dark to their second sleep. All of those nights have passed. All of those sleepers have woken and lived their days and returned to the dark and woken again. The long human rhythm of it, the rising and the returning, the first sleep and the second, the night and the morning. Your night is part of that rhythm. Your sleep is part of that long, unbroken human story of closing the eyes and trusting the dark and opening them again into whatever day comes next. The bolsters are gone. The demons are quiet. The humors are at rest. Let your own rest come now gently, without ceremony, without supervision, without any prescription about the angle of your body or the state of your soul. You are warm. You are safe. The night is yours. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.